I first noticed it in the Walmart parking lot. The kids had too much energy, so we went for an evening Walmart trip. As we walked back to the car, I noticed one of the streetlights in the far corner, blinking on and off. There's something about blinking street lamps that's inherently creepy. I don't know why. Maybe because we're evolutionarily designed to be afraid of the dark, and blinking streetlights often go out. Or maybe it's because of the stop-motion effect. There's a reason why haunted houses use strobe lights all of the time. In any case, I found myself staring at it as we helped the kids in the car, and that's when I noticed something was off. As a car drove by on the main road, the streetlight blinked off, and there was something there that obscured the red taillights for just a split second. It happened so fast, I thought I imagined it, especially when the light blinked back on an instant later, and there was clearly nothing standing under it. I didn't think much of it and got into the car. As we pulled out onto the main road, I glanced back at it. It was still flickering, and something about it sent a chill up my spine. We pulled out onto the road and the light disappeared from view. The kids thankfully went right to bed, and then my husband and I were unwinding in the living room. I was flipping through the pages on my Kindle when something caught my eye. The lamppost outside our house was blinking on and off. I walked over to the window. "What's up?" Charlie asked behind me, when I'd been standing there for a few minutes. "The light's flickering." "So?" There was a street light flickering in the Walmart parking lot too. I turned to him. "Isn't that weird?" "Not really." He went back to his snacks, pushing out the uneasy feeling in my stomach. I started to turn away. "Wait." I turned back. There was a light on in the house across the street, but when the lamppost blinked off, the black edge of the window wasn't quite straight. I squinted at it. There was a bump or a curve, almost like a semicircle, that was poking into the golden square of the illuminated window, like something was standing there, partially blocking out the window's light. Except nothing was there, because the shape disappeared every time the light blinked back on. "Charles, come back over here." "Do I have to?" "I see something weird." "I don't know." I glanced back at him and frowned. He was leaning back in the recliner, feet up, stuffing himself with chips. "Please come over." All right. He heaved himself off the couch and came over. I described the curve to him, the little sliver of silhouette I was seeing. "I don't see it." "You don't see it?" He shook his head. "There's nothing out there, Becca." I squinted again into the darkness. Then I gave up and settled back in with my book. Something woke me up in the middle of the night. I rolled over and tried to go back to sleep, but then I heard it again, a distinct thump coming from somewhere in the house. "Charles, I heard something," I said, shaking his shoulder, but I didn't wait for him to wake up. I flicked on the hall light and ran to the kids' rooms. My son, thankfully, was sleeping soundly. I leapt for my daughter's room and stopped dead in my tracks. In the crack under the door, I could see a flickering bluish light. I grabbed the doorknob and burst inside. The nightlight, it was blinking on and off, erratically, casting the entire room in jerky stop-motion flashes. I ran over to the bed. Thank God, my daughter was there, sleeping peacefully. I glanced back towards the hall to look for Charles. I froze. There was a dark shape in the corner of the room. I could only see it for a moment when the nightlight flickered out. As soon as it came back on, the corner was empty. My heart pounded in my chest. I stared at the corner. Off, the shape was there. On, it wasn't. Off, the shape looked like someone crouched in the corner. On, it looked closer. Off, oh God, it was closer. On, The intervals were getting longer. I was paralyzed. My breath was stuck in my lungs. Off. Oh my God. It was halfway across the room. On. The light blinked on. Remained on. That didn't give me comfort. I couldn't see it. It could be anywhere. It could be right in front of my... Off. I screamed. It was right in front of me, filling up my entire vision. I backed away, putting myself squarely between my daughter and me. Click. Yellow light filled the room. Becca? Charles stood in the doorway, bleary-eyed. I glanced around wildly, but the room was empty. The nightlight was still off. I leapt forward and pulled it out of its socket. It clattered to the floor. Then I began to sob as I told Charles everything. The next day, the whole thing seemed ridiculous. What? I really saw some figure huddled in our house that disappeared in the light? It made no sense. It was much more likely that I'd seen some sort of sleep paralysis demon, or my half-asleep brain misinterpreted shadows or something. But when I went into my daughter's room later, something caught my eye. 3 coarse long black hairs lying on the carpet. And now, as the sun is setting and the deep shadows of dusk are filling the house, I'm terrified to turn on any lights. As a kid, I was scared of pretty much everything. At night, I'd see faces moving in the wallpaper. I'd see branches slither like snakes. Piles of clothes turned to slumped bodies. Lamps looked like heads, and the front of cars grinned at me with sinister intent. I could also hear them. A creaking door would sound like a groan. The wind would scream, and floorboards would breathe heavy sighs. To me, there were ghouls, ghosts, and monsters around every corner. Needless to say, I was a nervous kid. Turns out, it wasn't just an active imagination. I have a condition. It basically boils down to a chronic overactive pareidolia. You know, the thing where you can see faces in cars or shapes of people in trees? That's pareidolia. It's a sort of defense mechanism that humans have evolved to notice camouflaged creatures, like jaguars and snakes, and to discern the sounds of encroaching predators. But to me, it's about 16 times more noticeable than what is normal for the average person. I see things everywhere, all the time. Of course, there were treatments. By age 12, I had tried 6 different regimens over a total of 4 years, and the side effects were brutal. Some would make me irritable, while others would make me hyper-focused. One type of medication just straight up put me to sleep. By age 18, I thought I'd never get a job. I was barely dragging myself through school, and there was no way I'd make it through college. I was on a course of drugs that barely kept me together, but they gave me these awful tics. I'd drop things. I'd wake up in the middle of the night. My leg would shoot out and trip me. I was a mess. My mom had to cover the stairs in handrail and grip tape. A few years ago, I had a standing meeting with the county employment services every Thursday. I hated it. On a particularly bad day, my mom had to drive me there. The meds were kicking my ass. She dropped me off at the end of the street, and just in that short walk to the office, I almost tripped into a brick wall. I was so flustered I knocked over a trash can. But for the first time in a couple of years, I had an interview with a potential employer. I didn't think much of her. She was just some old woman in a warm coat. She introduced herself as Teresa and told me that she'd heard a lot about me. She offered me a trial and a hefty one-time payment. I didn't get a clear idea about what I was supposed to do, but she told me that secrecy was part of it. The only demand she had was that I stop taking my medication. Still feeling the trash smell on my pants, I took Teresa up on her offer. On my first day of work, I had no idea what to expect. I'd been off my meds for a week, and I had barely slept. It was hard to wrap my head around the world as I'd seen it as a kid. I'd see faces in the walls, in the shadows, in the leaves, in patterns, pretty much everywhere. I'd hear voices and screams in every breaking car, in crinkling paper, in creaking floors. It was hard to stay focused, and I was so jumpy I could barely move without flinching. Teresa picked me up in a gray sedan. She was wearing a headset and I kept looking over at the GPS. I noticed her leg was twitching and that she kept biting her lip. She barely looked at me that whole ride. We finally arrived at a small yard, about a 40-minute drive off the highway. There were 2 large trailers and a single-story run-down prefab house from the 60s. One of those things with cheap wood panels and matching broken windows. There were 8 other vehicles in the yard, 4 sedans, 2 vans, a Jeep, and a bus. They'd set up warning tape, a command tent with laptops and an antenna, spotlights, and half a dozen crates covered with blue tarps. There were armed men with assault rifles, security personnel with handcuffs, and a couple of medics standing by with first aid kits and stretchers. I was swarmed as soon as I stepped out of the car. They fitted me with a headset, protective gloves, a heart monitor, and tagged me with a plastic ribbon around my left wrist. All the while, Teresa was just looking around, a bead of sweat stinging her eye. "What are we looking for?" she asked. 3, 4, just 1, I heard in the headset. "We got it early. You got the spot?" "On site," she responded. "Any blues?" "No blues. We're clear." Teresa finally turned to me. She faced me, put her hands on my shoulders, and talked slowly. "This seems like a lot," she said. "All I want you to do is go inside carefully and tell me what you see." "Why?" I asked. "What's in there?" "I don't know," she sighed. "None of us know, but we think you can see it." "Is it dangerous?" She shook her head. "We don't know. We're trying to get to know them." There was a flurry of instructions. I had to sign a waiver. They took pictures of me from 6 different angles and took several blood samples. They took a swab of my tongue, checked my eyes, and fitted me with a pair of safety goggles. Teresa took them from me just seconds later. "Nothing around the eyes," she said. "You need to see clearly." They asked me to open the door while they were running some kind of diagnostic. Weapon checks, system checks, ready checks. It felt like we were launching a rocket. I could feel my legs shaking. "I'm with you all the way," Teresa said over the headset. "You can leave at any time. Just tell me what you see. And I really mean what you see." A countdown began. At 0, the spotlights turned on, and the entire yard turned into a soundless ghost town. Everyone held their breaths. It was my turn. I stepped inside. A simple 1-story house. 3 rooms, a bathroom, a kitchen. Someone had clearly lived there until recently. There were still clothes flung over a chair in the living room. The power was off, but the pale spotlights coming in through the windows made it feel like I was walking through a hospital waiting room. My heart was pounding out of my chest. I didn't know what to expect, but this payday could be the boost I needed to get my own place. A paycheck with 4 zeros for a single day of work. But standing there, looking into the sterile living room, I was having doubts. "What do you see?" asked Teresa. "Do you notice anything?" "No, just furniture. A couch, an old TV, a fancy carpet. Nothing out of the ordinary." I just walked around, saying out loud what I was seeing. As the minutes passed, Teresa was getting impatient. "These are just things," she said. "I need you to tell me what you really see." I entered the bathroom and immediately felt this awful feeling in the pit of my stomach. A noise tickled my ear. Looking in the bathroom mirror, I could see something moving behind me. In a heartbeat, I caught a glimpse of a pair of blue eyes. I turned around screaming. Something moved. I flung myself backwards, closing the bathroom door with the tip of my fingers. I stumbled, tearing down the shower curtain and crushing a cockroach. Laying there with my feet in the air, I tried to remember to breathe. Rarely have I ever been so scared that I had to remind myself to breathe. My fingers tingled with adrenaline. "Tell me what you saw," Teresa yelled. "What's in there?" "Blue eyes. It had blue eyes." "Did you see where it went?" "I didn't. To the best of my knowledge, it was still outside the door." "Look again," she continued. "Look again, then get out." She had to coax me out of the bathtub. She encouraged me, spurred me on, and reminded me that I had to leave that room one way or another. It probably took them 15 minutes to get me out of the tub, and when I finally did, I could barely feel my feet. When I finally opened the bathroom door, I couldn't see anyone. The hallway was empty. I carefully stepped out, looked around. Nothing. Standing in the middle of the living room, I felt like an idiot. This was exactly what I was taking my medication for. Paranoia and sudden bouts of fear. It dawned on me that maybe I was influenced by all the people outside and their preparations. I was walking in here expecting to see something. They'd worked me up for it. So of course I was seeing things. But then again, there was an odd painting on the wall that I hadn't paid attention to earlier. It was the strangest thing. It was a sort of thrift store painting, showing two women walking across a bridge on a hot summer's day. It was sort of generic, but I'd been hyper-vigilant when I first stepped in. You know that feeling when you say a word over and over so many times that it starts sounding like a noise? That's the feeling that fell over my eyes. The picture started to blur and disappear, turning into swirling colors. And there, in that blur, I saw those blue eyes. There were small blue spots in the water, on the sides of the bridge in the painting. That's what I'd seen. And there, I'd seen a face. Something blending into my sight, disappearing. And for a second, I knew for certain that I hadn't seen this painting when I first stepped inside. And now, it knew that I could see it. I felt it. I slowly started to back out. "There's something in the painting," I whispered. "In the living room." "Are you sure?" Teresa asked. "Absolutely sure." "Absolutely." "Get out, now." I rounded the corner and heard the floorboards creak. I could no longer see the painting, and I could sense something move. Backing out of the front door and into the autumn air, I could feel hands on my shoulders. Armed men pulled me back, and paramedics started to check my eyes with flashlights. They asked me all sorts of personal questions, like my name, my mother's maiden name, and the name of the president. I was told to lay down. As I heard the team breach the house with stun guns, cattle prods, nets, and a crate, laying there and feeling the pressure subside, I just cried and laughed. I didn't even notice Teresa sitting down next to me. I was given a cold drink and a pill, and I took it without question. "You did good," she said. You're done. "What was that? What's in there?" "Something only a special mind can see." That was my first time working with Teresa. Over the coming years, I would be called out about once or twice a month, and the pay I got from those few days was enough to get me out of my parents' house. Teresa would check in with me weekly, and I had to submit to regular checkups. But more often than not, I was completely off the leash. I started to learn a bit more about the company I was working for and what they were doing. I started getting payments from Hatchet Biotechnica, a subsidiary of Hatchet Pharmaceuticals. My official title was contractor, a title that was repeated like a name. Teresa started going into greater details on what to look for and how to act, but that first mission was a sort of test to prove myself. I had no idea what I was actually proving, but it felt like my tendency to discern patterns and seeing dangers helped me along. I learned a bit more about their procedures. For example, they were adamant about checking for blues. This meant surveying the nearby area to look for some kind of infection, usually taking the form of miscolored flowers, most often blue, but not always. Sometimes tulips, most often sunflowers. One time they just found a bunch of teeth sticking out of the wall. Whenever they checked for blues, this is what they would look for. Something overtly strange and unnatural. When something like this was found, the whole mission would be called off, and they would use controlled explosives to just take out the entire area. In more populated areas, they'd set up tents and use flamethrowers. I remember once, the week before Christmas, when 6 men with flamethrowers were called in to burn down a greenhouse. I'll never forget the way the flames were reflected off their visors. To them, it all just looked like flames. But I saw something else. I saw bodies, writhing in the flames. I heard screams in the shattered glass, and in the charred remains of melted plastic, I'd see pained faces glaring at me with hateful black eyes. Up until a few months ago, I had worked a total of 33 cases over 2.5 years. Every case, I'd step into a location and look for 1 to 3 things hiding in plain sight. Up until that point, I still had no idea what they actually were. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of something running past me, or see a pair of blue eyes looking at me from across the room. Every time, I just reported it and left. A chair, a fridge, a suspicious window. Hell, once it was a music box. This time, we were just coming up to a house. It was a rainy autumn evening, and the area was already set up when we got there. I saw a for sale sign knocked over by one of the Jeeps who'd taken a wide turn. I got suited up. Blood samples, plastic wrap, all that jazz. It was set up to just be another job. Although I was still nervous, I was getting better. "No blues?" asked Teresa. "None," said one of the armed men. "We're looking at a single tango." "Are you sure?" Teresa squinted. "First report said 6. "Secondary reading says 1. We might have runners." "Notify the Galapagos," she sighed. "Put him on that hunt." She turned to me with a smile, tapping me on the shoulder. "In and out. You got this." "I got this," I repeated. Yeah, standard routine. Countdown, spotlights. Game on. It felt like stepping onto a stage. As I walked through the door and saw my shadow stretch out across the floor, I felt like a hunter, that I was the one to fear, and that whatever stayed in this house tried to hide for good reason. "The floor is crooked," I noted. "Strange place." "Are you sure?" "Yeah," I nodded. "Definitely." I steadied myself and started checking the rooms one by one. I waited for that feeling to emerge. My eyes seeing through the obvious and seeing the picture beneath the picture. The blue eyes emerging from nothing, and the patterns of shadowy figures growing clearer. Just relaxing and expecting that feeling to wash over me was enough to put me at ease. But I could still feel a primal part of me tickling my nerves, expecting me to panic. But nothing happened. I checked the kitchen, the living room, the bedroom. There was nothing. Just a strange crooked floor, empty rooms, and the echo of my own footsteps. An empty guest bedroom with a single window. Through it, I imagined scowling faces in the trees outside. 20 minutes passed, and I got nothing. I reported to Teresa, and she assured me that they were still getting readings from the inside of the house. Something was still in there with me, but I hadn't seen anything. I went through the cycles of denial, fear, and anger over and over. What was I missing? Finally, I just sat down in the middle of the living room floor. I scratched my eyes, sighed, and tried to relax. "Teresa, I'm not feeling it. Are you sure?" There was no response. "Teresa?" "Yeah," she responded, absent-mindedly. "Yeah, no, we're good. Hold on for a minute." "We're good?" I asked. "What do you mean by we're good?" Again, no response. I stomped around for another 10 minutes before I went up to a window facing the front yard. It was hard to see through the glare of the spotlight. "Teresa, I'm coming out. The place is empty." As soon as I opened the front door, I saw 24 faces fixed on me. Maybe they were surprised to see me, but I got the sense that there was something else. I could tell something was off. They all looked at me with strange expressions, some neutral, some smiling ear to ear. One of the paramedics just stared at me with slack-jawed terror. It was as if they didn't know what to feel or how to express it. A hole sunk through my stomach. I got that hollow feeling as my eyes glazed over, like I was staring at something else, like I was staring at something false, something hiding a pattern. This was the sense I'd been looking for inside, and now I was feeling it. In the far back, I saw Teresa. She stepped out from behind a Jeep, smiling ear to ear. Behind the shape of her face, her eyes emerged, glowing with a cold blue. One by one, their eyes flared up in a blue glow. And there, in a moment, my paranoid sight registered human-like shapes in the grass around them. Headless, mauled bodies. Imposters, lookalikes, mimics, nightmare beings, having tricked us into a trap. One by one, smiles started creeping across their faces, rows of impossibly sharp teeth hiding long tongues, their fingers growing longer, their necks elongating. They were losing their disguises and facing me, head on, unafraid. Nothing was said out loud, not a word, but to me, it was as if the wind itself was screaming for me to run. I slammed the door behind me and ran. Faces were coming out of the walls, door handles turning into hands, grasping at my clothes, my distorted face reflecting in windows and mirrors with jawless grins. I couldn't blink. Every heartbeat, a new horror forced my eyes open. There were more doors than I remembered. There were more windows than there should be. The kitchen suddenly had a skylight, and there were 4 fridges. Countless paintings had appeared in the master bedroom, depicting cruel and blood-drenched horrors. They were already here, trying to surround me, and my mind was racing to remember what was real and what wasn't. Rushing to the back of the guest room, I remembered there being only one window. Now, there were 2. I had to roll the dice, take a guess, do something. As I grabbed the window frame, I imagined teeth slamming onto my hands, tongues licking across my palms, wide smiles sating their hunger. But this time, it was just my imagination. I burst through the window and took off running into the woods. Through the night, I just kept going. My chest hurt from holding my screams in. Without my medication, everything in the dark looked like something reaching out for me, trying to eat me, trying to grab me. Creaking branches sounded like laughter, and howling winds were screams. I must have run for hours when my foot got caught between 2 rocks. As I stumbled to the ground, twisting my ankle, I saw them descend on me. I felt their fingers scratching me. I writhed on the ground, screaming for them to just let me go, to just please stop. Please let me go. But after a few seconds, I realized I had just scratched myself on the underbrush. There was no one there. I was safe. I broke down crying, trying to ignore the twisted face reflecting off the full moon above. Eventually, I made my way home. There were no messages waiting for me. All my numbers had been taken offline. All ways to contact them were just gone. And there was no info on the firm that hired me. Hatchet Biotechnica exists only on paper. There's no location, no contact info, and no names attached. It's all a front. I haven't heard from Teresa since. I think that whoever I've been working for, I think that whoever I've been working for have just assumed I'm dead. That's why I decided to share this anonymously. Those who know who I am can reach out to me, and for those who don't, I just have a word of warning. Be observant. Trust your intuition. It just might save your life. I've been an investigator and hunter of the paranormal for longer than I care to remember. Studying lore, protecting the innocent, and destroying malicious entities are just a few of the job's many requirements. In my younger years, training day in and day out with my uncle, I thought we were heroes and that I had the greatest job in the world. Now that he's dead, along with most of my friends and family, I'm not so sure. The monotony of endless travel in cheap hotels, the guilt of not being able to protect my loved ones when they needed me most, the burden of saving others. It's more weight than I ever thought would rest on my shoulders, more weight than most men can bear to carry. But enough about that. You don't need to hear some sob story. This isn't about me. This is about my latest adventure, one I almost didn't come back from. A few months ago, while digging through various news articles and police reports for choice words like bizarre and unexplainable, I came upon a tabloid piece about a man named Jack on a business trip. He apparently became hysterical and attacked his boss Coulter in a hotel lobby. When asked why, he simply said that room 371, the room Coulter was assigned at the front desk, was no ordinary room, and anyone staying there was in grave danger. He said he was trying to protect his boss by explaining the situation, while pulling him away and out of the hotel. Coulter resisted and fell on the floor, breaking his arm in the process. He didn't press charges, but needless to say, their business trip and relationship was no more. Normally, I stay away from these kinds of things. More than not, they tend to be the product of a nutcase. This one had all the markings of an overtired, overworked man on the verge of a mental breakdown. Still, it piqued my interest. With no other pressing cases on the table, I decided to look into it, if for no other reason than to placate my curiosity. A bit of research revealed that the Covenwood Inn, the hotel where Jack and Coulter were staying, only had 2 floors with room numbers ranging from 101 to 256. There was not, nor had there ever been, a room 371. This wasn't enough to build a case, but it was strange nonetheless. I couldn't find any contact information for Jack, but I found an email for Coulter on a site dedicated to networking for investors and business leaders. He responded, but only gave me a brief account of the incident, not wishing to discuss the specifics. In his summary, however sparse, even he described being handed a key card for room 371 before Jack grabbed him. The plot was thickening. Next order of business was to call the hotel. I did this on 3 separate occasions spread out across the week, with 3 different aliases, and spoke with 3 different staff members, ranging from entry-level to management positions. In the hunting business, this is known as the rule of 3, provided you can sift through the BS and identify the potential truths within. It allows for a higher chance of information retrieval without raising suspicion. It works even better if you can act and change your voice accordingly. Call number 1 was to the hotel manager. As I suspected, no matter how persistent I was, she would not comment on the matter. Call number 2 was made to lower-level management in the form of Tammy, a shift supervisor. She wasn't working on the day in question, but had heard a lot about it from coworkers. She said that Jack was a lunatic, kept screaming about a list of rules in his hotel room. I wanted to pry for more, but we were disconnected. I'm fairly certain I heard the manager come over and scold Tammy before the line went dead. Call number 3 was to the front desk. For this one, I decided on a backhanded approach. I would attempt to book the non-existent room 371 to see if the clerk would bring up the incident on his own. Upon dialing, the voice that met my ear was steady and emotionless. "Thank you for calling the Covenwood Inn. How may we be of service? Is it possible to book a specific room?" "Of course, sir. Which room would you like to stay in?" "Room 371. "One moment." There was a brief pause and the faint sound of tapping at a keyboard. "Room 371 is available tonight and every night going forward. When would you like to book your stay?" Impossible. Did I call the right place? Was my information wrong? "So, you're saying room 371, that's 371, is available?" "Yes, sir. tonight and every night. And this is the Covenwood Inn in Massachusetts? Indeed it is. And your hotel has only 2 floors with room numbers 101 through 256, right? Correct, sir. How then is there a room 371? There was another pause. This one was much longer than the previous. Thank you for calling the Covenwood Inn, where we always hope you enjoy your stay. Goodbye. Well, I'll be damned. Despite my doubts, it looked like I had found my case. I just needed to do a little more research before going out on a full-fledged hunt. Most entities travel. It's doubtful that this one struck once and then moved on. If I could find its signature and establish a pattern, I could probably pick up its scent and predict its next attack. All I had to go off was Tammy's second-hand account of Jack screaming about a list of rules. That would have to be my starting point, and down the rabbit hole I went. 5 days of non-stop research, and I stumbled upon the motherlode of paranormal activity. Dozens of accounts of mystery survival guides left in apartments, hotels, and workspaces. Strange sets of rules with a sizable body count left in their wake. The next move was clear. I had to call Al. Al was an old soul who had been around the paranormal block more than a few times. His hunting days were behind him, but he was a walking encyclopedia of knowledge. If anyone could shed some light on these lists, it was him. Al's recognizably scruffy voice cut through the receiver after just one ring. "Henry, you bastard! How the hell have you been? Glad to know you're still alive after all this time. Would it kill you to pick up the phone once in a while?" "I know, Al. I'm sorry. Caught up in the gig. You know how it is. How's your heart? Still giving you trouble?" Of course. But you and I know I've been through worse hell than a few clogged arteries. To what do I owe this call? I'm sure you didn't reach out to discuss my declining health. I've discovered something big, Al, and I need your help. Must be big if you're calling me instead of diving in head first with no parachute like you usually do. Al was referring to a particular case we worked together a few years ago. His last one on the field. I was a foolish and cocky son of a bitch. We followed up on a bad tip I received from a less reputable source, and found ourselves smack dab in the middle of a dense forest, surrounded by a coven of dreamwalkers. They're nasty creatures with an appetite for children's nightmares, only attacking the waking under the light of a full moon, which just so happened to be the case on the night we went out there. It was a trap, and we walked right into it. We managed to kick and claw our way out, but just barely. Al took most of the onslaught. I carried him out to the main road and we were picked up by a passing truck and brought to the hospital. The physical damage was healed, but Al was never the same after that. He never said as much, but I swear he blamed me for what happened. Even if he didn't, I did. I can't ever forgive myself for that one. There are these strange survival guides being left in random locations across the country, and they're racking up quite the body count. I don't know if it's... Al interjected with a heavy sigh. I know exactly what you're talking about. You should probably swing by my place to talk more about it. Al, you're across the border, over 300 miles from where I'm... Damn it. Al was a stubborn man and a lonely one at that. He probably just wanted a visit, and I couldn't really blame him. After all, I was the reason he turned into an old hermit in the first place. Whether it was the guilt over breaking his spirit years ago, or my lack of options, I made that drive and crossed state lines on my way to see him. If anything, it would at least be good for him. It was just how I remembered it. A perfect little cottage tucked away in the middle of nowhere, far away from the outside world. Not the house you would expect a hunter to live in, but that's how Al liked it. Small and quaint. I think it reminded him of his late wife Ellie. She used to talk about a dream home like this one, if my memory serves. Al rushed out to greet me. There you are, you bastard. Get over here. He pulled me in for a bear hug. I reciprocated, happy to see him in person for a change. All right, Henry, let's go in and talk shop. We unembraced, and Al brought me inside where I sat on the sofa. He brought me over a TV dinner, a common meal in our trade. and a beer before sitting down in the chair opposite me. Okay, Al, what do you want to know? This is big. You were right about that. But he threw me a concerned look, indicating that I might not like what he had to say. Come on, Al. I drove hundreds of miles to hear this. It better be good. Define good. Come on, Al. Good news is I know what we're dealing with. I swear the man dragged out every simple response just to keep me from leaving too soon. That, or he enjoyed dangling fresh meat over my head, just to watch me swipe at it and miss. Probably a little of both. And the bad news? The truth is, I've been tracking this thing for years. You're not going to be able to catch it, kid. Its course is completely random. By the time a headline shows up, she's already moved on to another town, with no trail or breadcrumbs to follow. She? Yeah, she. Could be a he. But you and I know males are pretty rare. It's a witch, Henry, and a powerful one at that. Al went on to explain that the lists of rules were agreements between the witch and her victims, contracts that needed no signatures to be legally binding. Once the rules are read and comprehended by the victim, the agreement takes effect. If one or more rules are broken, a supernatural calamity will befall the victim, usually resulting in their death, at which time part of their life force is absorbed by the witch. With each soul piece she takes, she becomes even more powerful. Why do people break the rules in the first place? It's all part of the design. Most of the rules are simple spell traps, dependent on time triggers. To most people, it's absolute nonsense. Even I, with my vast knowledge of the paranormal, would be hard-pressed to not use the bathroom after 11:22 p.m., just because a list of rules I found on a motel dresser. How do you know all of this, Al? I learned most of it from a man who stayed at an Airbnb near Cape Cod. He found a list and broke each and every rule but still managed to make it out of there alive. He even gave me the damn thing. What? You mean you have it right now? You've been holding out on me this whole time? Al walked over to his desk, opened up a drawer, and pulled out a sheet of paper. He then walked over to me and tossed it on my lap. It won't do you much good. I've examined it more times than I can count. It was beautiful, in a morbid sort of way. I had been studying the case for so long. It felt amazing to have a piece of the history in my hands. A physical piece of evidence I could inspect with my own eyes. Feels different from normal paper, wouldn't you say? It's papyrus. I imagine the other lists are made from it too, necessary for the spell. I turned it over and noticed a dark splotch near one of the bottom corners. Al, what's this? A stain, I guess. Probably wine spilled from the last guy who had it. That wasn't wine. I was sure of it. I raced over to Al's bookshelf and grabbed a copy of Demonic Dealings by Jack Grovewood and began flipping through the pages. Al, what do we know about witch deals? Aside from these ones, they're verbal contracts between a witch and a human. One wish is granted in exchange for a piece of their soul. Why? What are you getting at? I found the page I wanted and scoured the text until I came upon an image. Aha! I held up the picture of two hands dripping red over a chalice. And how were these deals sealed? With blood from both parties. We know all of this, Henry. This is different. She doesn't need permission and there's no wish granted. You break a rule and you're toast. That's it. Clearly, this type of contract doesn't need blood from the victim. But what if it still needs the witch's blood? You know, to bind the soul piece to her when it's done. I held up the list and pointed to the dark spot. Al thought it over for a moment before it all sank in. You genius son of a bitch. Are you saying that we have the witch's blood right here? That's exactly what I'm saying. But what does it matter? We can't cast a summoning spell without fresh blood. No older than 2 months. I received this ages ago. I know, but there's no statute of limitations on blood packs. That's how ghosts are able to make deals with demons, witches, and the like. If we create our own list with identical ink and paper, and smear some of this blood onto it, it should work the same way and bind the witch to the deal. When we break the rules, she'll have to show up to collect. Then, well, we kill her. Al shot me a dirty look. Are you insane? Another one of Henry's misguided tightrope walks. Glad I'm alive to see this one. We don't know the conditions of the spell. There could be more to it than this. And you want to risk it backfiring? Or worse, it actually working? And us getting ourselves killed by one of the most powerful witches we've ever gone up against? As the words rolled off his tongue, I sensed the excitement in his voice. He was dying to work another case. After being on hunter's leave all these years. Al, are you in or not? He turned his head for a moment, and then turned back to meet my gaze. You bet your ass I am. Another week of research and gathering materials later, and we had what we needed. Witch-killing instruments, stakes soaked in the Dead Sea and wielding torches, and a list of rules uniquely equipped for Al's cottage. Rule number 1, all lights off by 10:41 p.m. Rule number 2, leave the bedroom door closed at all times. Rule number 3, do not step outside after sunset. Rule number 4, if anyone knocks at the front door after 3:45 p.m., do not answer it. Rule number 5, if your television is set on, do not tune in to Channel 9. After spreading a sample of blood from the previous list on the back corner, we got to working breaking as many rules as we possibly could. 12 hours passed. We left the lights on all night, opened the bedroom door, turned the TV to Channel 9, and walked outside after sunset. Then, we waited for an inevitable knock at the door. It never came. We waited and waited and waited, sitting on the sofa with stakes and torches in our hand. But there was no activity, none whatsoever. Even without the knocking, something should have happened. We had broken 4 of the 5 rules. At 2 o'clock in the morning, Al turned to me and shook his head. Looks like it was a bust, kid. Just as I was about to swallow my failure and admit defeat, a gust of wind pushed the front door open, and a clean-cut man in his 50s, gray hair, gray mustache, waltzed in with a smile on his face. It looked as though he was a male witch after all. Hello, boys. Looking for me? Al and I raced over and pushed our stakes through him. There was no effect. We then held our torches up and attempted to burn his skin. Again, no reaction. This wasn't good. With the flick of his wrist, the man was able to swing us up through the air and pin us up against opposite walls via an unseen force. No spell recited. Just pure, powerful magic. Is that any way to treat a guest? We tried to break free, but it was no use. I didn't have to show up, you know. Using my blood was a good idea, but your list was voided the moment the ink touched the page. Without my handwriting, the thing's useless. He cackled as we squirmed. I just couldn't resist seeing this for myself. 2 humans meddling in my affairs, attempting to draw me out of hiding. Whatever did you think you would accomplish? He shut the door behind him, walked over, and sat down at the sofa where we had previously been seated. And the stakes and fire? What a great laugh that was. You know, as a powerful witch, I can ward myself from just about anything. With enough soul shards, you can pretty much render yourself invincible. And let's just say, I have plenty to spare. What do you want? I screamed out, impatient as ever. Al looked at me wide-eyed, almost as if to say, what the hell do you think you're doing? Punishment, of course. You may not have broken the rules of one of my actual contracts, but that doesn't mean I can't dole out some just desserts. Just then, there was a knock at the door. What's this? The witch said in a delighted tone. It looks as though we have more guests. Please, come in. The door swung open and 2 figures walked in. 2 figures I recognized. It was none other than my uncle and Al's wife. They walked over to us and the witch released his hold on us. Aren't you happy to see your loved ones? Back from the dead? Without warning, their forms changed. Their fingernails changed to claws that bent and curved towards the carpet. Their mouths opened at unnatural angles, revealing rows of sharp teeth that protruded outward. Finally, Their eyes met at the center of their heads, creating a single pool of yellow light swirling in on itself. A life all its own. Then, they attacked. Al and I jumped and darted around the room, but it was no use. They were too fast, their arms too long. No matter what we did, they kept on pulling us in and tearing away at our flesh, bit by bit. Before long, we were both being tightly squeezed in their arms. Our pained cries echoed through the house.
Oh, what's wrong? Don't you humans live for our tender embraces? It doesn't get any more loving than this.
Just as our spines were about to break, Al did the unthinkable. Wait, I want to make a deal. All at once, the creatures loosened their grip and the witch spoke, just as surprised as I was. Oh, now that's something I didn't expect. Tell me, Al, what do you have in mind? A piece of soul for your safety? Sorry, but that just isn't worth it. I'd rather see you bleed. As a single droplet rolled down his cheek. Let the kid go, and you can take me now. The whole damn soul. It's yours. The creatures vanished and the witch's face lit up. Al, what are you doing? You can't. The witch put his fingers together and my mouth was clamped shut. Sorry, kid. I'm getting too old for this. I'm tired. My wife's gone. My daughter's gone. You're the only family I have left. The witch chimed in. You have yourself a deal. Al looked over to me, one last time with a smile. At this point, my face was soaked in tears. I never blamed you. I may not be your dad, but I would have been so proud to call you my son. And with that, they disappeared, and I never saw them again. I fell to the floor, breathless. It was over. There was nothing I could do. Somehow, some way, that witch will die. I will bleed his corpse, rip apart the flesh, bury the bones and salt the earth if I have to. And I'll tell you what, I'm going to save Al while I'm at it. Whatever it takes. Mark my words. Late last summer, I was going north for my brother's wedding. It was at the start of my vacation, so I decided to make a few stops on my way up north. I'd make a stop for camping, another for a day of fishing, and so on. My brother, who was stopping in Minneapolis, was pushing hard for us to have a day to go shopping together, and I just wasn't feeling it. He was all head in the clouds in love and talking about his blissful future, and it kinda just soured my mood. I was passing through a small Minnesota town when I decided to make my first stop. Fishing. That would get me far away from the blinding smile of my brother. It'd just be me, a six-pack, and all the time in the world. There was a lake that ran through the west side of town and curled into the woods. There was a dirt road coming around the back of the lake, opposite of the town. It would probably take an hour or two just to trek back to town through the undergrowth. It was a pretty big lake. The locals seemed friendly enough at the gas station, and you don't need a license to fish. So I figured, hell, why not? So I drove the long way around, parked my car, got my gear, and dug along the tree line for bait. Didn't take long to fill up a jar. I followed the path back down to the lake, bait in hand. It was almost lunchtime, and I'd gotten a few sandwiches and a six-pack from a nearby gas station. I had this really comfy camping chair, an audiobook, and nowhere to be for the next 18 hours. Hell, if I skipped my Minneapolis shopping spree with Smiley McGee, I could stay an extra day out here. Also, this gave me an excellent excuse to just skip going there at all. Needless to say, I was psyched. As I walked up to the lake, I noticed a wooden sign, handmade and painted, with clear text, Melonhead. I stopped to just reread it a couple of times. Melonhead? What the hell was a melonhead? I took a picture of it and kept walking. As I got closer to the lake, I started hearing frogs. Like, a lot of frogs. There was this strong, intense smell of vegetation in the air. But, as every good outdoorsman knows, frogs are basically a sign of a healthy ecosystem. Sure, In some environments, they can be intrusive, but that wasn't the case up north. I put up my camping chair on the beach. I took off my shoes and prepped 2 fishing rods. I put them into empty bottles that dug into the sand so I could set them aside. I leaned back in my chair, cracked a cold one, and put a baseball cap over my face. As Will Patton started reading me the Bill Hodges trilogy, I completely zoned out. This was what I'd been working for all year. This was a proper vacation. I must have fallen asleep, probably for an hour or so. When I woke up, I'd completely lost track of my audiobook. My beer was warm by now, and my fishing bobbers had drifted all the way back to the beach. I got up, reeled in the lines, and reached for my bait, only to notice it was tipped over in the sand, empty. That's strange. I left my gear on the beach, got a shovel, and returned to the tree line. It took me longer to find bait this time, and I had to go a bit deeper. The frogs were a bit more quiet now, and there were a few clouds gathering on the horizon. I decided that I wouldn't stay unless the rain passed me by. I didn't want to get stuck in a muddy tent overnight. I could sleep in the car, I suppose. As I got back to my camping chair, I had a bad feeling. Something seemed out of place. I wasn't sure exactly what, but it looked different. Something had been moved. Will Patton kept talking in my ear, but I was no longer hearing the story. By now, it was just noise, like a friend who didn't know when to stop talking. As my phone chimed with a notification from my brother, I turned it off and took off my headphones. It took me just a few seconds to realize that all the frogs had gone silent. I just stood there with my bait jar, hearing an eerie wind pass through the birch trees. I decided I'd give it another go. If it started to rain, I'd just sleep in my car. So I got back, threaded my bait, and threw my bobbers out one more time. I set my rods back up, put my headphones back on, and put away my lukewarm beer. As I brought up my phone and started rewinding the audiobook, I noticed a ripple on the lake. Not a big one, but a noticeable one. Probably a fish breaching the surface. Maybe this wasn't a lost cause after all. Just a few minutes later, the first bobber dipped under the surface. It immediately came back up, but now I knew that the fish were biting. Moments later, the second bobber dipped. I held my breath, waiting to see the bobbers dip for real. There were fish there. It was only a matter of time. But minutes passed by, and I got a strange feeling. I reeled in one of the bobbers and noticed the bait was completely gone. I reeled in the second one, and it was the same. Bait was gone. Very determined and skilled fish in this lake. Definitely. I decided to try something different. I brought up my box of spinners and found a black and blue lure that usually worked on bass. My best rod had a spinning reel, so that would work just fine. I set it up, stepped up to the edge of the beach, and threw it out. A solid, beautiful arc way into the lake. Half an hour passed, and I just got back into the rhythm. The click of the spinning wheel, the smoothness of the line. It was nice. Then, a bite. Not a big one, but a bite. Finally! I hooked it and started reeling. Not twitching, just a solid, steady reel. Probably not a big fish, about a pound at most, but now I had something to show. Would probably make a neat Instagram post, or something for my Tinder profile. Laugh at it if you want, it works. My lure was about halfway back when the line suddenly snapped. It wasn't even from the pressure. It was as if the line was just cut. The fishing line snapped out of the water. I just dropped my rod in the sand and threw up my arms. What the fuck? I yelled to myself. What the fuck was that? And there, out on the lake, another ripple. I had enough. I packed up my things, trudged back to my car, and dumped it all in the trunk, even the lukewarm beer. I left a bait jar in the sand though. These worms were useless. By the time I sat down in the driver's seat, the first raindrops had started spattering against the hood of my car. Then, my phone chimed. Of course, The third time, my brother was asking if I would make it to Minneapolis tomorrow. I groaned out loud. I couldn't take that kind of toxic positivity. I just couldn't. I needed space. Sorry, I texted back. I just set up camp. I'm here for at least another day. So as to not make myself a liar, I decided to stay the night. I'd sleep in the car and just listen to my audiobook. That was kind of camping, right? I had a tuna sandwich packed away, and my lukewarm beer was almost palatable. Not much of a dinner, but I didn't feel like going back to town. It felt more appropriate to just stay out in the woods. I put my headphones back on, turned off notifications, and let Will Patton creep back into my mind. As the clock crept later and later, my lukewarm beer was running out. About 9 p.m., after a long nap and checking my YouTube subscriptions, I had to take a bathroom break. The woods had gotten really dark, really fast. I didn't have to go far, so I just stepped out into the forest and did my business. For a moment, I just stood there, breathing. I could see the lake from there, and I noticed another ripple. It was bigger this time. I zipped up, walked back out onto the dirt path, and took a second look. There was something in the lake. Nothing big, but something round, about the size of a basketball. I got back in my car and updated my Instagram. I was a bit pissy about not getting the fishing picture out of this trip, but hey, at least I got a picture of that weird sign. Maybe someone out there knew what it meant, so I took another look at the picture. I noticed two things. One, that round thing in the water can be seen in the background, down by the lake. Two, there's a small spatter of color at the very top of the sign. It kinda looked like the sign was broken, now that I looked closer at it. It gave me an idea. I took one more trip out of the car, following the dirt path. Now, I could hear frogs again, and they were getting louder. Probably the rain luring them out. Using my phone as a flashlight, I looked around the sign. Just as I suspected, there was a second part of it, just off the path. It had been broken in two. The text was clear. Don't feed Melonhead. What the? I started thinking about what I'd done all day. My bait jar was going empty. Bait being picked from the hooks. My fishing line being cut. Had I been feeding whatever the hell kind of animal Melonhead was? I turned back to my car, only to see something standing on the path. I didn't raise my phone. I didn't want to make any sudden movements. I just froze, like a deer in headlights. I could barely make out a humanoid shape, but I got this sudden realization that I was out, alone, in the middle of nowhere, and now something was blocking my path. It was tall, like 2 heads taller than me. It had sort of a hunchback, and these long webbed fingers. It had this irregular breathing, rattling a large sack in its chest. I dropped my bait jar on the path in front of me.
More.
This awful gurgling noise, somewhere halfway between a regurgitation and breathing in. I carefully picked up the jar and looked up. Whoever this was had this big melon-sized head. This was what I'd seen sticking out of the lake all day. It even had a tint of green. I need my shovel, I gasped. It's just...
More.
It stepped towards me with a splat. I fumbled backwards, tripping over my own feet. I crawled into the underbrush and just started digging with my hands. I stood there on my hands and feet, ripping into the ground with my fingers. Thick globs of something sticky dripped down as Melonhead loomed over me. Every now and then I felt something wiggle between my fingers as I filled the jar with dirt and worms. I held it up, and Melonhead just poured it over its face. The dirt was filtered out and spat back out, as the jar was dropped back down next to me.
More.
I must have dug for hours. Just as soon as I filled the jar, it emptied it. Hour after hour, I just dug, and dug and dug, breaking my nails, having my fingertips cut by little rocks and roots. I have no idea how long I was there. Hours, an eternity. Every time I slowed down, There was just this sound like a man-sized rattlesnake getting antagonized behind me. I even stopped pleading. I just kept going. The rain intensified, drenched me, but I couldn't tell if my shivers came from fear or the cold. At some point, when I held up the jar, it didn't take it. The sun was rising out of the dark clouds, and the frogs had gone quiet again. My knees crackled as I got back up, and my fingers were trembling. I was covered in dirt, and my clothes were soaked. There was no one there. I leaned against the closest tree, tried to find the right words, but instead just collapsed into crying. When I got back to my car, I plugged in my phone. As it charged, I called the one person I wanted there, my brother. I had to get away. I just drove mindlessly. I have no memory of what I did, or how I ended up at a gas station. I don't have the slightest idea of how my brother found me there. I just remember being glad he did. It's taken me a long time to come to terms with what happened. For a while, I thought I'd had some kind of mental breakdown, thinking that what I experienced was something I just made up. I didn't talk about it. It sounded ridiculous to say out loud, but I was really there, all night. I was on my hands and knees digging. I wouldn't do that for nothing. I was there, and so was Melonhead. I decided to finally make this post after I found a couple of people posting a picture of that same sign on Instagram. It was still broken in half, and right there, in the background, was that brown thing bobbing in the water. I was never a very good person in life. I cheated on my wife, cheated on my taxes, stole from my business partners, beat my kids anytime they looked at me wrong, and overall just acted as a general scumbag. In hindsight, I see it clearly. I just wish I could start fresh and do it all over again. One night, on my way home from my law firm, a freak ice storm covered the highway. I had four-wheel drive and didn't think about the falling sleet and hail until a truck in front of me began to slide, then jackknifed and flipped, landing not even 10 feet in front of my SUV. I had no time to react. I slammed the brakes at the very last millisecond, but ended up going into the side of the trailer at 70 miles an hour without a seatbelt on. The last thing I remember was time slowing down to a crawl as I flew through the windshield, shards of safety glass glittering like stars all around me in the winter air. Then, it was blackness. I awoke, screaming and hyperventilating, in the same blackness, but without any pain. In the darkness, I felt my body, running my hands over my arms, legs, chest, and face. I didn't seem to have a single broken bone or laceration. I was even in the same expensive Armani suit I had been wearing during the accident. It seemed miraculous that I somehow survived unscathed, without even a tear in my suit. I stood in the darkness, putting my hands out in front of me and stumbling around in short, hesitant steps. After a few minutes of this, I ran into a wall. The wall felt warm and seemed to vibrate under my fingers. I pushed on it, and my hands went into it, like pushing into silly putty. I began to rip away pieces of the wall and throw them behind me, and a shaft of light pierced through the hole I had just made. The light illuminated the cavern I was in, showing a floor of cobblestone soaked in layer after layer of dark red clotted blood. The wall itself looked like the guts of some massive creature. It had long shards of white bone running through the top and bottom, with smaller pieces of bone connecting them. The rest was some light red and vibrating tissue, like intestines that had been unspooled to form a never-ending solid wall. I looked down at my hands and saw with horror that dozens of black maggot-like worms squirmed all down my wrists and hands. With a yelp and a jump backwards, I frantically tried to shake them off, but I could feel hot stings coming from my hands as they bit me, over and over. After a few minutes of writhing and rubbing my hands together, I got them all off. I could feel my heart beating out of my chest, and instinctually kept checking the rest of my body to make sure I didn't miss any more of the biting, blood-sucking maggots. The soft, fiery light that came through the hole I made in the living wall, it showed me a door on the opposite side of the hall from the wall. From what I could see, it had a straight hallway that went off into the darkness. Having no other good options, I started walking down the hall, the minuscule light quickly fading into nothing. I put my hands out in front of me and felt the smooth stone walls. I walked in a straight line for what felt like hours, before seeing a glimmer of red light. At first only a tiny pinpoint. As I walked towards it, it grew and grew, until I realized I was staring at a door that must have been 20 feet tall, surrounded by polished white bones on all sides. The bones that composed the framework of the door were so massive that they looked like they had come from a blue whale, as if someone had taken the ribs off of one and fused them together into an archway. All I could think of as I approached this door was my wife, my child, my job, everything that I identified as me, everything that gave me meaning. Despite having cheated on my wife many times, I still loved her deep down. After all, I had protected her from the knowledge of what a poor husband I was, simply out of love for her. I had never let my 5-year-old child suspect that his father was involved in anything illegal or immoral. My love for them had made me protect them from all the things I had to do to guarantee us a better life. And now, I just wanted to see them again, to be with them. I knew I was basically a good person, and I just wanted another chance to prove it. I kept their faces in my mind's eye as I walked through the massive archway. It looked big enough to drive a tractor trailer through. I saw flickering light coming from the other side, and taking a deep breath, stepped over the threshold. What I saw horrified me and shocked me into stillness. I had walked into an open field, the dark red and black clouds above blocking out any sky. The light filtering through them cast everything in a bloody glow. The field itself looked at first like a farmer's field, with finely spaced rows of soil plowed into perfect lines. Growing out of the earth stood many squat brown plants covered in thorns. Out of the tip of each one, a large egg sac clung, weighing the plant down and bending many of them to the ground. The egg sacs were pale and unbroken, filled with fluid and dark silhouettes in each one. I saw beings writhing, one adult-sized silhouette in each sac, some putting their faces up to the wall of the sac in a silent scream, others trying to reach their arms and legs out through. But the sturdy covering of the yolk just bowed out with their arms and legs and didn't pop. It looked as if the people inside the eggs were, like they were all drowning. I quickly began speed walking between the lines of horrifying plants, wondering whether the plants fed on the people in the sacks, or whether it just fed them and gave birth to them. As I passed the first row, one of the sacks burst and a torrent of fetid, rotting fluid burst out, dumping out a beautiful naked woman at my feet. She had long blonde hair and green eyes, flawless skin and a tiny upturned nose. She heaved in a deep breath, as if she had been drowning, before looking up at me. "Oh God, please don't hurt me." I shook my head and helped her to her feet. "Why would I hurt you, ma'am? Everyone here hurts me," she said, starting to weep. Her fingers shook as she sobbed, bowing her head in a pathetic way. I grabbed her arm. "I promise you, I won't hurt you. I'm one of the good guys. But I think we should get going," I said. "We really need to find a way out of here." "Out of here?" she asked, crying and laughing at the same time. "There is no way out of here. Don't you know where you are?" I shook my head. "This is hell. I don't know if it's the hell in the Judeo-Christian sense, but it's close enough. Everyone here is dead." I don't feel dead," I said, rubbing my hands all over my suit, my face, my hair. "Everything seems intact." She nodded at this, her crying quieting down as she focused on my face. "Everyone comes in like that," she said, "until they catch you, torture you, burn you, rip you apart. Then, when your body is too spent to feel anymore, They bury you in these fields. These plants grow overnight, encasing your body in a sack and bringing it up to the surface, where it starts to feed you and revive you. After you're healed enough for another round of torture, the fruit plant bursts. But who brings you to these fields? Who's in charge? I asked. Her pupils dilated, her eyes wide. She whispered the answer. The angels. At that moment, a bolt of lightning shot down from the red sky, bursting open dozens of plants nearby, and showering us in a mixture of blood, amniotic fluid, thorns, and leaves. I grabbed her arm. Let's get out of here. We can talk more when we get somewhere safe. She laughed at this, as if it was the most absurd thing she had ever heard, and we began to run. By the way, I said, gasping between breaths, my name is Jay. Angela, she said, at the end of the field. I saw a paved road. It had countless potholes and cracks running through it, and some parts of it had been wiped out and fallen into a stream that ran parallel to it on the farther side. But I was still glad to see some sign of a trail. A road, I cried, pointing in excitement. Maybe that road leads somewhere out of this hellhole. She shook her head in amazement at my stupidity, but I ignored her. I had to hope there was some way out, that this wasn't just a never-ending landscape of horrors under a blood-red sky. The road seemed to stretch out in both directions forever, fading into each horizon in a perfectly straight line. I could see parts of the road were entirely missing, and it looked like some bridges had collapsed further down the road in the direction I was looking. So I turned the opposite way and started moving, holding Angela's hand as I went. Her presence gave me some comfort. She even reminded me of my wife to a certain degree, as they both had light skin and an overall Irish cast to their faces. If this is hell, then why are you here? She looked up at me, surprised by the question. Heaving a deep sigh, she looked away. No sense in keeping secrets here, I guess, she said. We're just gonna get captured and tortured to death again anyways. That's all it is here. Just a never-ending cycle of pain and death. A lot of these people completely lose their minds. She rubbed her hand over her eyes, as if her head hurt. I always wanted to be an actress, but I grew up having no money. I met an older man who said he believed in me, and that he wanted to take me to LA. But we needed money to get from the East Coast to LA, and to live there while I looked for work. He convinced me to rob a bank with him to get it. Needless to say, it didn't work out very well. He got spooked and murdered 2 tellers, before a security guard came out and shot him in the head. I grabbed his gun and killed the guard, took the money and ran. When the cops caught up to me, I pulled over slowly, put the gun to my temple, and pulled the trigger. I had absolutely no intention on going to prison for the rest of my life. I was just a stupid kid. I couldn't believe that this angelic, innocent-looking young woman had participated in murders. It shocked me to my core. If this is hell, I don't really feel like I belong. Yes, I did some bad things, but I never killed anyone, never put a gun to anyone's head. I never even killed an animal. She looked up at me sharply. You're only lying to yourself, she said. No one innocent comes here, but I don't really care what you did, to be honest. We are both trapped here, and that's all I need to know. There is no hope. Just don't betray me. Our only chance of surviving longer is to stick together and trust each other. As we ran, the fields began to fade, and what looked like an old, dilapidated western town began to take their place. I saw people hanged by their neck from the street posts. Overall, it seemed the safest place in the area, so I began to pull Angela over in that direction. There was an old saloon with a swinging gate, and we walked in, wary of any traps. I saw what looked like a medieval knight with massive white wings flowing out from his back. He held a man's mouth open while another man in a full suit of glowing blue armor poured molten metal lead down his throat. The man screamed for a moment. Then the lead ate through his neck and he collapsed to the ground. Those are the angels, Angela said to me. Their heads turned towards us, but there were no faces there. It was just an empty black void under a platinum helmet, one that seemed to glow from its own inner light. They approached me, and I grabbed Angela. "Please, please, take the girl and let me live," I screamed, my heart bursting with anxiety in my chest. They looked at each other, then back at me. "Tell me how to get out of here and she's all yours. I'll hold her down while you burn her alive or cut her to pieces. Please, I just want to see my family." In my utter astonishment, they nodded at me. One spoke in a deep, slow cadence, his voice sounding like thousands of voices of different pitches, all mixing and echoing over each other. "You can ride the lightning up to Earth," one said. "The lightning connects us to those calling on magic, those who call on demons or try to contact ghosts. Any who are weak and small can be overwhelmed by those who ride the lightning up to them and possess them, but you will always return to us in the end." I nodded, throwing Angela in their direction and turning to run back into the field. Lightning was crashing down all around me, bursting egg sacs and plants every few seconds, but I was no longer afraid of it. I looked up at the sky and saw a swirling whirlpool of red and black, and stood under it as a bolt of lightning struck me directly in the center of my head. I felt myself being sucked up at incredible speeds and saw, above the clouds, a deep void. I fell into the void and saw through another set of eyes, two teens playing within a Ouija board in a graveyard, giggling as if it were a game, surrounded by black candles. "Demons, we call on you to answer us," one of them with a high voice shrieked. As his mouth opened, I rushed into it. His eyes widened in shock as I pushed his soul out, sending it spiraling back into the void I had just emerged from. I now had complete control of his body. "Hey man," the other kid asked me, Are you okay?" I nodded, smiling, looking around at the clear sky, and feeling relieved to be back. "Yeah, I've never been better, buddy." As I took over the body of the teenager, a sense of euphoria and exhilaration filled me. I had escaped from hell. I looked around the cemetery, frowning, scanning the mind of the child I possessed. I gained his name, Kurt, and his address, among other critical information. I found myself in Maine, in the absolute middle of nowhere, but it would have to do. The friend stared at me with wide eyes, clear anxiety marring his expression. "You don't look good at all, man," he said. "You look pale as shit all of a sudden." My body wavered and I tripped, nearly falling before the friend grabbed my arm and steadied me. Scanning the mind of the kid, I found the name of his friend. "Thanks, Andre," I said. "Maybe it was just something I ate, a little touch of food poisoning or something. I guess I really don't feel that good. I'm just gonna head home." Andre nodded seriously at me. "I'll grab the Ouija board and candles and everything," he said. "Too bad we didn't get to see anything supernatural happen." "Yeah, too bad," I said, walking away. If he only knew. Out of the corner of my eye, as I started walking down the side of the road under the streetlights, I saw the silhouette of an angel, like the ones I had seen torturing people in hell. Its wings spread out massively behind it, 20 feet in each direction, softly swaying to and fro like a flag in a slight breeze. But when I turned my eyes to look directly at it, there was nothing there. Nothing besides an ancient oak tree with countless branches reaching up to the moonlit sky. My eyes are just playing tricks on me, I said to myself. Then I remembered the horrifying thousand voices of the angel, as it turned its empty space of a face towards me, how it said to me, "You will always return to us in the end." I shuddered. I felt like it had been staring directly into my soul, judging me, and finding me wanting. I had never done psychedelic drugs in my life, but I felt like I was on what I imagined LSD or peyote to feel like. I kept seeing figures out of the corner of my eyes, shadows running across the street, faces in the trees, and eyes staring out from the surrounding forest. But whenever I turned my attention to them, they disappeared. It was like something was mocking me, always staying directly out of the view of the center of my vision, but playing games on the periphery instead. The ground began to tremble, as if an earthquake were starting. I heard running from behind me, and turned to see Andre standing there, sweating and out of breath. "God, did you just feel that?" he said, his eyes widening with fear. I think we're having an earthquake. We don't have earthquakes in fucking Maine. What the hell is going on right now?" He was right. When Maine had earthquakes, they were generally so small that no one felt them. But right now, it was just getting more and more intense. Trees began to fall in the forest, the smashing branches creating an echoing cacophony that blotted out all of Andre's words afterwards. I saw his lips moving, but I couldn't hear anything besides the crashing of the earth, the collapsing crypts in the nearby cemetery, and trees continuously breaking apart. All of a sudden, I felt a whooshing sensation and heard deafening crashes inches away to the left of me. A massive pine tree branch crashed into the ground, its smaller branches slicing up my shirt and my back as it fell. At that moment, Kurt and I began to run to the only open area that was close, the cemetery. It seemed like the only place where we wouldn't get crushed to death by falling trees and branches. We didn't even have to speak to each other, but both sprinted in a blind panic, breathing hard, my heart beating out of my chest, the shaking behind us getting so bad that the road was starting to crack. We sprinted as fast as we could, nearly tripping a few times as the pavement heaved and split around us, and more branches fell in the distance. The forest around us sounded like it was coming apart. I heard alarms go off in the distance. First car alarms, and then the wailing of a tornado siren from the center of downtown. People were definitely waking up, noticing something was very wrong, and I had a feeling it was all my fault. As we ran into the cemetery, I first began to see for certain that this was not a normal earthquake. Hands were reaching out of the ground, some skeletal, others with some flesh still hanging on to their cracking bones. I could see the muscles and tendons of those closest to us as they moved with frantic energy and unbelievable speed, shoveling dirt away and ripping a hole open as fast as they emerged from underneath. Crypts flew open as bodies bashed through the doors with superhuman strength, sending shards of stone flying in all directions. From the eyes of every corpse, I could see pure blackness, just like the blackness of the faces of the angels who controlled hell. The blackness was piercing, shimmering, beyond any simple absence of light. It was as if a hole was actually ripping in reality right where the eyes of the corpses used to be, and all of the hundreds of them stared directly at me, ignoring Andre completely. Then, in an instant, the shaking stopped. The silence was deafening and eerie in the aftermath of such a cataclysm. All I could hear was the ringing in my ears and the pounding of my heart.
"You will return to us,"
the corpse in front of me shrieked. His voice sounded like thousands of deep, distorted voices overlapping. He was a half-decomposed elderly man in an expensive Armani suit, strands of white hair still hanging on the papery skin of his skull, his teeth and muscles of his jaw showing through the decayed holes in his cheeks as he spoke.
"Do you need more rope to hang yourself with, sinner? Will you not accept your fate? You dare take the body of an innocent child just to fulfill your own selfish desires and try to escape the fate that you deserve?"
Another corpse began to move in from my right, a young woman who looked much fresher, but had a massive bullet hole through her forehead. Otherwise, she almost could have still been alive. Yet she spoke with the same voice of the other corpse, the cacophony of many beings blending their vocalization together almost, but not completely in sync. Her screaming was so loud I felt my chest vibrating, my heart thudding painfully in my chest as the corpses closed in around me.
Haven't you had enough, Jay? You are rotting from the inside. Only hell will purify your evil. Return to us. Give up the body of the child. Now!
I felt around Kurt's pockets, having only one idea to get out of this situation. I knew I couldn't return with them, and in his right pocket, I found what I knew would be there, a pocket knife. Grabbing Andre quickly, I flicked open the knife and put it to his throat. Stand the fuck back! I screamed as loud as I could, my throat hurting from the sheer force of my yelling. The circle of corpses stopped moving in on me, but my heart was still beating too fast. My hands trembling so badly I thought I might drop the knife on the ground. I wanted to throw up, but I managed to avoid it. I'm serious right now. I will fucking kill this kid in front of you if you all don't let me go.
Have you gone so far down, Jay?
The elderly man said to me in the voice of an angel.
You know you must return to us eventually. Why accumulate more evil to repay? Your kind never learns. But you're not a stupid man. You must know we cannot allow you to stay here in the body of this innocent boy.
He shook his head, almost like a disappointed parent. My hand shook so bad that I sliced Andre's skin slightly. Andre yelped, and a few drops of blood ran down his neck. Kurt, what the fuck, man? He whispered to me. Let me go. This is crazy. You don't have to do this. I don't know what's going on, but I'm not Kurt, I said. I possessed him during your little ritual with the Ouija board, but I'm not him, and I am not going back to hell. No way, Andre. You have no idea what these things do to people there. They pour lead down their throats. They hang them from every pole on the street. They burn them and cut them and torment them. Then when their victims are too used up, they're buried in a field, where they're healed and come out of some massive eggplant, just to do it all over again. How can anyone expect me to go back there? That's totally insane. I would rather die. At that moment, a fleet of police cars and ambulance started to drive by, their lights flashing but their sirens off, since there was no traffic out. But they slammed on their brakes once they saw the massive crowd of people standing in the cemetery. The cop in front got out, looking confused. Then he saw that the people standing around us were not really people at all, with their decomposing bodies, black eyes and skeletal figures. His jaw fell open.
Holy shit,
he whispered. More cops got out behind him, all of them looking confused. Some pulled out their guns and started screaming orders at the walking bodies, while others got back in their cars and locked the doors, staring out in horror, unsure of what to do. Some of them called for backup on their radios. One cop got in his car and drove away like a madman, swerving between the ambulance and other police cars in front of him, his sirens now blaring. He looked like he was screaming inside the car, and I think he flipped us off as he sped away. I suppressed a sudden urge to start laughing hysterically at this absurd scene. If I started laughing now, I might never stop. I felt like I was losing my mind under all the stress. I don't know who started it, but one of the cops fired his gun as a few of the corpses started walking towards them, and all hell started breaking loose. The circle of corpses rushed at the police, and then all the police started firing at once. The gunshots made my ears ring, and I heard a few bullets smash into the crypts and tombstones immediately to my left, whizzing right next to my head and chest. I let Andre go and ran for my life. I don't know if he made it out of there or not. He might be dead for all I know. I scanned Kurt's mind and found his house. He was only 14 and so, of course, lived with his parents. But I needed a place to rest and think, and that was the only one nearby. I ran to the house, running up the stairs without speaking to anyone and locking the door behind me, shaking, shivering, sick with fear and worry. I laid down on the bed and started to cry for myself and everything I had lost. I thought about my wife and my kid, my old life and how I missed all of them. and I started sobbing uncontrollably, the tears staining the pillow as I screamed into it in desperation and anger. As I write this up, I look out the windows and keep seeing the silhouettes of angels out of the corner of my eye, and now the ground feels like it's starting to shake. I think they're coming for me. I wonder if I should keep running, or if I should just go with them to that sick place with the red clouds and the people constantly brought back to life, just to be tortured all over again. I'm thinking about taking Kurt's parents hostage if I have to. The angels don't seem to want to see innocents die, and that may be my only chance. I still have the pocket knife just in case, and there are plenty of bigger knives downstairs if I decide it necessary. Yet, the voice of the angel from the cemetery keeps repeating in my head, "Do you need more rope to hang yourself with, sinner?" As a child, I was prone to waking up in the middle of the night. About once a week, my eyes would burst open as if something had awoken me, but there was never anything there. There were the echoes of a noise that I just couldn't recall, a silence that reminded me of something deafening, but no one else seemed to feel it. At first, I would simply try to return to sleep, but always found myself unable to. At some point, I would roll out of bed, pitter-patter down the hallway and try to wake up my brother so I wouldn't be alone in the night. No matter how much I yelled or shook, he would never wake up. Inevitably, I would find myself crawling into his bed and simply waiting what felt like hours until I would also return to sleep, comforted by his presence. I was just a little kid who looked up to his older brother, and I believed that he could protect me from anything, even in his sleep. As an adult, the problem persists. However, there is no one here to comfort me. I live on my own now, no family in the area, and no girlfriend in my life, but I still find myself waking up at least once a week. It is no longer to a silent sound that I can't recall, but rather to the sounds of a screaming baby just one house over. I don't mind it so much. I know it must be more of a hassle for the parents than for myself, but it can be tiresome. Instead of tossing and turning in bed, I brew myself some hot cocoa and add in just the smallest spike of Crown Royal whiskey. I'll then make my way to my computer chair, where I can enjoy an hour or two of some warm conversation on 4chan, before the fuzzy feelings of sleep invited me back to bed. When I first awoke last night, I had no reason to think this was anything other than business as usual. If the baby had been crying, I seemed to have just missed it, but it wasn't something I gave much thought to. It was a bit earlier than usual, about 2 a.m., and I stayed at my computer until almost 6. I knew the sun would be coming up soon, and had already enjoyed 2 mugs of my spiked beverage. If I didn't return to bed then, there wouldn't be another chance until the sun went down. It was my day off, but I could only sleep in until about 9, as I had plans to meet my friend pretty early for a trip to the beach. I crawled into bed, pulled my covers up over me, and let myself be comforted by the waves of warmth. As was typical, I found myself rolling over here and there as I waited to succumb to my tiredness, occasionally opening my eyes to try and peek at the rising sun's light through my window, but it never came. Rolling around quickly became tossing and turning, and peeks at my windows became glances at my phone. By 7 a.m., I knew the sun should be up, but it wasn't until 8 that I knew something must be wrong. I had to wake up in about an hour anyway, so I figured I might as well get an early start and wake myself up with a shower. Before heading into the restroom, I stopped to look out the blinds of my window and was surprised to see that there wasn't even the crack of dawn in the distance. I mused over whether or not I had missed something important, as if I could drunkenly forget daylight savings in the dead of summer. The thought of it made me laugh, but when I returned from my long shower, I was no longer laughing. It was almost 9 a.m. now, but the sun still wasn't up. I flipped open my phone with frustration and began a Google search for my own local time, thinking that my Android's internal clock had simply messed up. But the internet showed the exact same thing I was seeing on my device, give or take a minute. This led me on a hunt across the house, checking every piece of technology I had, from the old watch at the bottom of my drawer, to my computer in my home office, to the time on my TV. Everything showed the exact same consistent time, now well into 9:30. When flipping through the channels on my television, everything seemed to still be playing late night. There was no early morning news, no talk shows, and no traffic or weather reports. Every station was playing classic Looney Tunes, syndicated Black family sitcoms, and the kind of infomercials people only witness when no one else is awake. Next, I took to the internet. I scoured every social media platform I could imagine. Facebook had updates, but they were only the kind that you would see late at night. The 3 a.m. thoughts of people who binged watched something into the morning and needed to simply put their voices out into the world to be acknowledged. I tried to acknowledge them. I tried to reply. I tried to like. I tried to share. But there were no reactions to my reaction. Then came the cell phones. It started with text, but I gave up fast on that. I began to call every single number I had, even hotlines and businesses, but no one ever answered. I left messages everywhere, begging them to talk to me, begging them to tell me what was going on. But no matter what I threw into the void, nothing ever returned. I even placed a call to my local police station, first the non-emergency line, but then I called 911 when I only found an answering machine, though in the end, I got the same message. After hours of harassing people online and on my phone, it was now well past noon. I had been checking the windows to see if anyone else woke up, but if they did, they never left their houses. I didn't blame them. I was scared too, but how else could I discover what was happening to everyone else? And so, I donned my shoes, put on a shirt, and made my way to the front door. There is something unsettling about trying to leave your house late at night, before midnight. It feels like there is nothing to worry about, but after then, it becomes increasingly uncomfortable. Despite the darkness, however, this wasn't night. It was now afternoon, though that only made it more intimidating to step out into the black. I considered bringing some sort of weapon, but going and knocking on neighbors' doors with a weapon in hand in the middle of the night probably wouldn't get me invited in. And so, I went into the streets and began knocking on doors. I began 2 doors down, where I was on relatively good terms with the man who lived there. We were the only 2 on the block who lived without families, just 2 single men in their smaller homes with spare rooms. There was an unspoken understanding between us that we reached out to each other first when in need of some help. Most of the families surrounding us had children, after all, and were less likely to have the time or resources to help. His name was Kenneth, and he had knocked on my door late one night when he needed a ride to the emergency room some months ago. He had hurt his hand pretty bad and didn't think he'd be able to handle a steering wheel. As such, I knew he would owe me an understanding reaction to me knocking on his door late at night. Except, he didn't answer the door. I tried knocking on his window and garage before giving up, but there was no response there either. I moved on to the next house between ours and immediately rang the doorbell. No answer. I walked up and down the block knocking, but there was never an answer. I gave up trying to be quiet, trying to only alert the person in the house, but I never heard a noise in return. Even the house next to mine returned nothing but silence when I began beating my fist against the door. I couldn't believe it. This family had an infant son who cried at all hours of the day, even in the dead of night. He seemed triggered by the slightest noises, and they had even asked me to turn down my television one night so as not to disturb him. Yet, he had no reaction tonight. I returned to Kenneth's house, this time ready to let myself in. Without a family to worry about, he was less likely to be on edge, assuming he was even inside, though I truly doubted it. I had a feeling that I was the only one left on our street, that everyone else had left or been evacuated, and I needed to prove it. His front door was locked, but he was definitely the kind of man to leave his back door open. I let myself in, not bothering to sneak around or tiptoe. I wanted to alert him of my presence if it turned out he was home. I made my way to the end of the house, fully expecting to find an empty bed in an empty room. But it wasn't empty. There he was, Kenneth, close to how I saw him, just sleeping in bed. His hair was a tad bit messier than usual, and it appeared he was naked if the discarded boxer shorts on the floor were any indication. But he was there, so I said his name. Then I yelled it. I went from soft to shouting in a matter of seconds, unable to understand why I didn't wake him up before with all my yelling and knocking. Even at this close proximity, he remained asleep, however. What if he isn't asleep? A chill ran through me as a thought entered my mind. I rushed to the side of his bed, not taking the time to rationalize the possibilities of what could have happened to him. I shook him. I screamed. I tried hitting him, but nothing woke him up. His heart beat faster and his breath became heavier, but nothing woke him up. Even opening his eyes had no effect. I practically threw him across the room in my attempt to break him out of his slumber, but he fell without any resistance. No change. He was a living corpse, unable to react to anything. But was he the only one? I made my way out of his house, grabbing a spare object on my way, a frying pan that Kenneth had left on the counter. I crossed his yard directly into our neighbors, to the family with the screaming baby that had now become silent, and began to smash at their sliding glass door. I tried to be cautious stepping in, but I couldn't bring myself to care too much. When I sliced some of my skin open on the glass, I just needed to get in. I needed to see the parents, the children, the dog, to see if any one of them would wake up, but none of them would. The parents shared their bed. Their daughters were tucked in, and just like Kenneth, they seemed unable to wake up. I made my way to a room at the end of the hall, one I knew must house their youngest son since he was the only one I hadn't seen yet. I shook and I shook and I shook, but the little boy wouldn't wake up. I wanted to take the frying pan and bash him with it, to dare him to move, to dare him to end this insane prank that the whole town seemed to be playing on me, to cry like he would every other night, but I stopped myself. Instead, I was the one who cried. It wasn't manly, it wasn't smart, but it was what I did. I just sat there in this little boy's room and cried, not knowing what else to do. Even calling the police had just led to an answering machine. What else was there? I was all alone in the dark of night, except I wasn't. I heard a noise and froze. There was something else in the house. Then I heard the noise again. No, it wasn't in the house. It was in the room, and I recognized that sound. It was a sound I could never describe, the one that I could never remember. Yet somehow, it was also a noise I could never forget. It was the sound that woke me up each night, the sound that fades away as I return to consciousness, thinking I only imagined it in the silence. And it was in the room with me. I turned slowly to see the thing that made the sound behind me. It didn't look like a person, and yet, it wasn't a monster either. It was impossibly tall, with arms longer than its legs. It had to hunch to stop its head from pushing straight through the ceiling, and it smiled from ear to ear. No, that wasn't a smile. It didn't have cheeks or skin on its face. It just had teeth. Teeth that stretched from one ear to another to make it look like it was smiling. But it wasn't. It reached across the room from the little boy's closet, its fingers finding my face from almost a foot away from its palms, and it began to search it. It touched every muscle, every tendon, every pore, every cell in my skin as it explored my features as if it was blind. But it was staring right at me with those bright lights in its dark eyes. This was the thing that woke me up at night. The thing that woke up this little boy at night. That made him cry out in the darkness because of what he heard or perhaps even seen. I could feel it in his touch, his loneliness. It followed me, shrieking its strange shriek in the silence that somehow only I could hear, daring me to wake up, daring me to notice him. And I finally did. Today, it finally got me to look him in the eyes and share in the horror of the deafening shrieks it made with its teeth slammed together. Just then, the little boy woke up. He was barely more than a toddler and he began screaming, crying just like he did every other night. The creature in the closet turned away from me, its fingers no longer caring to explore my face, and instead, it focused on that poor little boy. I wanted to get in the way. I wanted to yell or scream or hit this monster with the frying pan, but I just ran. I ran from the room, from the house, from the street, and ran until I couldn't anymore. The baby stopped crying before I was out of earshot. I don't want to know what caused him to stop. I just hoped he was like everyone else, that he just went back to sleep, but I don't think that's how this works. It's now been over 24 hours. The sun was supposed to rise again, but I know it won't. In every house on every street I broke into, I found someone sleeping, but I didn't try to wake them. I didn't have to. I just knew that I had to keep checking to see if this was something that ended or something that just kept going forever. My tiredness comes and goes now. Sometimes I feel like I'm on the brink of passing out, and I welcome it. Then, I hear that thing shrieking in the distance, and I am brought back to a lucid state. No matter how far away I get, I can still hear it, and it's getting closer. As I write this, I am on the edge of town. I found an unlocked door and let myself in, needing to refreshen myself with a shower and some food. I doubt the owner will ever wake up, but in case he does, I'm writing this note for him and leaving it on his desktop. I wish I could write more, but I know that the creature is coming for me. I was quiet enough sneaking in here, but no matter how far I go or how quiet I am, it does seem to find a way to catch up with me. I have decided to steal this man's keys and take his car. I'm not proud of this action, but it seems to be the only way I'll be able to get to the next town over without crossing paths with that monstrosity again. I've decided to head north to my brother's town. I don't think he will be awake, but that's never been the case when I have sought his comfort in the night. Instead, I just hope to find him asleep. Perhaps if I spend the night in his bed, I'll fall asleep as well, as we did back when we were kids. At least, I hope so. If this message does manage to be found, I hope this story can help. On those nights where you're awake before the sun comes up, when you know something had to have woken you, but you find yourself surrounded only by silence, know that you aren't crazy, and whatever you do, go back to sleep, if you can. My mother sat across from me, leaning forward onto the old desk in her office. That's what she called it, her office. Even though it was just that desk, a stack of old papers, and a chair in a room no bigger than a walk-in closet. I remember there was an insect flying around the overhead light, clanking into the bulb every so often. That would draw my attention away from my mother's words, until she would snap her fingers and draw me back in. Eventually, she told me to listen up or that the consequences would be huge. The insect was of no fascination to me anymore. My older brother and I were homeschooled. She was our teacher, and she took her job seriously. She was questioning me in regard to my brother's absence from class that morning. I said I didn't know where he was. That was the truth, for the most part. She insisted that because we share a room, I must have known something about his whereabouts. Again, I said I didn't know where he was. For perhaps the first time in my life, I noticed my mother's age. Her face sagged as if the weight of iron bars was bringing her skin down. Whether it was due to the stress or lack of sleep or any other reason in the world, she looked far older than I had ever noticed before. After a while of her sitting there, staring at me with those burdening eyes, both of her arms folded across the edge of the desk, I finally suggested that we go looking for him. "And just where do you suppose we find him?" she asked. Maybe the woods? You know we aren't to go into the woods. I don't think he would have made it that far anyway. Somebody surely would have stopped him in time." "I don't know then. I don't know where he is." She stared at me for another infinite moment. Finally, the tension in her eyes broke. "Well, then you'll just have to go to your room and don't come out." So, I did. I trotted back to my room. It was only a few steps away from her office, but the tears had already begun to well in my eyes. Because I knew where my brother was. He did go into the woods, and I knew the exact path that he told me he was going to take. Like my brother, I wanted to leave. Unlike my brother, I was too afraid at that time to face the unknown. After all, I had never been in those woods, nor had I ever seen what sort of world existed beyond them, if any, for all I knew. I woke up that next morning to my mother banging on my bedroom door. Every morning, it seemed to be only one more beating away from falling off the hinges. I often wished it would, just so I wouldn't have to listen to that beating at 6:30 every morning. "Come on, come on, come on, don't be late for class," she yelled. She would repeat this constantly until I told her I was up and getting ready. My classroom was just in the main room of the house. I sat on a chair. She sat behind me. A desk was in between us, in case either of us needed to write something down. I remember that morning. I remember how my mother looked. Hollow. Perhaps she looked exactly like what she was. A mother grieving her missing son. Struggling to accept that there are far more important things in life. Things for the future. I suspected that she had went and consulted my father that previous night. That's what she would usually do in a crisis. He always reassured her that good things will come. I said my pledge before sitting down. I was always to open the curtains and look at the middle of the house on property as I said it. It went like this. "To my father, I thank you. Through you, the seeds of my life were sown. I will give my all to you, until there is nothing left to give. I am of you, and of you I will always be. I am with you, and with you I will always be." I sat down beside my mother. She wasted no time in telling me the story of a boy that ran from home decades ago. That boy, just a teenager at the time, was called upon by God to leave the horrors of society behind and to organize a group of good, faithful individuals, people that would act as God's replacement to society after its collapse. The man changed his name to Gabriel King before forming a community with a dozen women. Each woman was to bear 2 of his children. He warned the woman that their community is not immune, and that one day, a child will fall victim to Satan's temptations. The child will leave the community with the intention of bringing shame upon it. He also warned that following the first departure, another child would be granted, by God, the freedom of choice, either to stay and render his will, or leave and have the eternal horrors of Satan's doing bestowed upon him. "That's the prophecy," my mother stated. "You, based on clear evidence according to your father, are the one granted that right to choose. Not to sway your opinion, but I must ask, do you choose mortality, comfort, and our goodwill? Or do you choose immorality and a diseased evil livelihood?" She walked toward the door, careful not to let her black skirt drag on the floor, and opened it. "If you choose to leave," she continued, "I will not stop you. It would be an interference with God's will." A cool breeze flowed into the room. I sat in silence for a moment, contemplating, twiddling a button on my shirt. "I'll stay," I muttered. I had no real intentions of staying, and I knew that. Truthfully, I was afraid of the possibility that she was right, that I was choosing the will of Satan and turning my back on all that was good. My mind was made up, but I couldn't bring myself to admit my true feelings. Good, my mother said, then went directly into a new lesson. Days and days went by, until finally, on a night of no other significance, I worked up the courage to follow my brother's footsteps, almost literally, and never again see the stale, dusty, foul-smelling shack that I had called home all these years. There was nothing to my plan, just walk out the front door and leave. That simple. Only, it wasn't that simple. Not in practice. Sure, I wouldn't have to worry about the things the way my brother did. Everybody by this point had probably heard of the prophecy, and they would let me go. The issue is that my struggle was internal. Every day for years, I had given my allegiance to one man, to one lifestyle, and like everybody else around me, I held on to my faith without question. I believed in his sayings more than his doings, and I suppose that a part of me was just not ready to let that go. I had been educated only by the standards of my own small world. The idea that something bigger may be out there, ready to prove me insignificant, was terrifying. Leaving home for my first time was a wager on reality itself. Leaving and staying were both dreadful. My mind was juggling spheres of different colors. I realized that I was pulling my own hair. That's it. That's enough thinking. I thought, it's time for me to go. I walked straight into the woods. I wondered how many other people in these small homes had considered doing what I was doing. I could barely do it myself, so I just kept on walking. The woods are loud at night. Bugs and frogs and birds all chimed into some horrifying harmony. Wolves and coyotes made their noises heard on occasion as well. I couldn't begin to know what else was out there. Sometimes, it sounded like something was behind me. I'd look, but of course nothing was there. I was sure that I was psyching myself out, but the sense of something behind me remained throughout the entirety of the night. I was sure that I heard somebody screaming for help. My brother. Oh dear God. My brother is still in the woods crying and screaming, pleading for help. I turned left towards the screams. They sounded further away. I turned right and they were farther away again. I moved forward again. But the screams, his begging, never sounded any closer. I couldn't turn back. Oh no. No. I couldn't turn back. By that point, I had been walking forever. Listening to his pleading stab my ears, always sounding the same distance away no matter how much I walked. I threw up a prayer to whatever entity wanted to listen. I didn't care at that point. To please let it all be in my head. I'd rather be going crazy than to have to listen to my poor innocent brother scream for help, when there is nothing I can seem to do about it. I kept on moving, not even willing to stop when the pain of the rocks and needles and twigs on the ground made my feet bleed and sting. At some point, the sky lightened up. Many of the noises, including the screaming, finally subsided. The birds sang much more lovely music. Finally, I came to the edge of the woods and everything was calm. The edge of the woods was nothing more than a long, narrow clearing before the trees began again. A trail of fading black rock made a seam straight through it. Yellow and white lines ran the middle and edges of it. Now I know that that was a road. At the time, I had never seen one. It never came up during schoolroom discussions. My legs were excruciatingly sore. My feet had moved past the point of pain, and were now numb lumps of meat shelled in mud and blood. I didn't know what to do, where to go, or who to meet. In fact, I was afraid of seeing anybody. Soon enough, I felt the ground rumble just a tiny bit and heard a dull whistling. I turned my head and waited. When I saw it, I knew what it was. In school, my mother had explained that a vehicle is a machine that can transport people faster than God had ever intended humans to travel. If we were meant to move that fast, she'd say, God would have made our legs go that fast. Funny how she said all that, and didn't bother to mention the roads they drive on. It was a big vehicle with an open box attached to the back. I didn't expect vehicles to look like that. It slowed down and stopped on the grass beside the road. The driver hopped out and ran to me. I considered running back into the woods. This man is going to snatch me and commit unspeakable sins against me. Surely that's what he was going to do, I thought. I felt paralyzed and couldn't turn away, even if I wanted to. The man stopped before me. He was mostly normal looking, a bit bigger than most people I had ever known. There was hair on his face, something I had never seen before. "Jesus Christ, son," he said. "I ain't even gonna worry about asking you no questions. Get in, I need to take you to the police." He finished off his sentence by taking off his hat, scratching his thinning head of hair, and carefully replacing the hat. I followed him back to his truck, half trusting him and half afraid of what might happen if I didn't. The first time I saw Police Chief Richards, he was leaned back in his office chair with his feet on his desk. When he saw me, he promptly dropped his feet and leaned forward. His eyes appeared to have widened to the size of apples. He motioned for me to come forward and have a seat. The chief calmly did another visual scan over me, then looked back at the man who walked me into the office. Calmly, he looked at the man and said, "Jesus, Leonard, I've seen some shit in my day, but nothing like this. What's the story?" "A guy found him on the side of the road, brought him straight here. That's it. I think the kid says he doesn't have a name, but I can barely understand him. Well, boy." The chief looked back at me. "Come take a seat. I'm Police Chief Richards, by the way. You don't have a name, I suppose. How old are you? Do you know where you're from?" "I'm 14. You're not gonna hurt me, are you?" I asked. Chief Richards kept his right ear toward me as I talked. He shifted his eyes to continue looking at me. He listened carefully and intently. "You're asking if we'd hurt you? Now, why on earth would we do that? No, we aren't here to hurt you. We want to help you, because you sure look like you can use some of it. Now, where are you from?" He spoke softly and smiled again at the end of his sentences. "The woods," I told him, in order to keep it short and understandable. "I'm looking for my brother. Have you seen him?" "Looking for your mother? Leonard, shut the door behind you and take some notes, would you?" "Son, I'll be happy to talk to you about your mother and see what we can do. I need some basic information first. Do you know where at in the woods you come from?" "No, brother," I said. I even drew a B and an R in the air, so he'd understand that. "Oh, your brother. Leonard, hand this boy a sheet of paper and your pen. It'd be a lot easier if you could write stuff down for us, okay?" I wrote down all the information I could give him. I wrote that I was 14, looking for my brother, and that I'm from a community in the woods, but I have no idea where at in the woods. "Okay, how many people are in the community?" 35 now that my brother and I are gone," I wrote. "Okay, son. We'll send some people out there to find this place. They must be the ones that did this to you, right?" He pointed towards my arm and my face. I sat in silence for a moment. I didn't know what to say. I took my sheet of paper and wrote the truth. It was an awkward moment of writing, but I did it. Father would make all of his children dedicate themselves to him one piece at a time. For me, it was my arm, an eye, an ear, and my lips. For my brother, it was more. Much, much more. He was close to being fully dedicated. Some tears smudged the ink as they fell onto the paper. It hadn't occurred to me beforehand how much like a monster I must look to these people. A boy with a missing arm, an empty eye socket, just a plain hole for an ear, not even any lips, just exposed gums and rotting teeth. I felt disgusting. Chief was pale. "And your brother?" he asked. "I suppose he must have crawled out of that place." I nodded, and tears continued to fall. After a long moment of silence, the chief looked at me and said, "You know, son, we're all born into some kind of cult or another. I'm glad I got you out of yours." A couple looking for their first home together finds one that's perfect and cheaper than anything else on the market. It's a little worse for wear, but with a little TLC, it could be a home they could raise a family in. That's the start of most horror movies you'll see nowadays, but somehow not too far-fetched, right? My girlfriend, Sarah, and I were that couple. We are young, in love, and wanted to live together so badly that we gathered up what little money we had to find our own place. Honestly, I was content with an apartment in the middle of town, but she convinced me that a mortgage would be cheaper and assured me it would be worth it in the long run. I wanted to rip my hair out as we searched for a house that we wanted within our price range. Everything was so ridiculously overpriced that we almost gave up until we got a phone call from my mom. She had heard from a friend of a friend who knew someone that was putting their house up for sale. We called the number that she had texted us, and we talked to the previous owner, Joseph. On the phone, we met with the jovial husky voice of a man who told us that the house had originally belonged to his uncle. Joseph's uncle had left the house to him, but he had no need for it and wanted to sell it. Sarah and I were trying to contain our excitement when he told us how much he wanted for the home, so we quickly made our arrangements to check the house out before we made any deals. The following morning, we went to the address he had sent us. The house was in a rural area, about 30 minutes away from town, and when we got there we were in awe. It was so picturesque with its long gravel driveway that led us to the beautiful faded white farmhouse. To be honest, I was still in shock at the price Joseph had set. This was a lot of house and land. There had to be something wrong with it, right? When we reached the house, there was a small red truck parked at the end of the driveway. A burly man dressed in jeans and a red flannel shirt stood at the front steps, looking up towards the house. We got out of the car and called out a greeting to him, but he didn't break his gaze until we got a couple of steps away from him. He turned to look at us and shook his head a bit as if he were shaking himself from a trance. "Oh, sorry about that. I haven't had my coffee yet," he said as he turned to face us, flashing us a cheerful grin. "Quite a beauty, eh?" "Oh my God, it's so cute," Sarah answered as she stepped beside me. I let out an awkward chuckle as I responded. "Yeah, it's almost too good to be true." Joseph looked at the both of us, then back towards the house. "Yeah, it'd be a shame to let such a good house go to waste. And I know how hard it is to get a house these days. Anyways, come on, let me show you around." We followed him up a couple of the steps and through the front door. He gave us a bit of history as he showed us around the house. It was built in the mid-80s by the family of his uncle's wife. They moved in after they had married to take care of her parents up until they had passed. They stuck around, didn't have a family of their own, and Joseph told me that they had both also died here. I turned to look at my wife to see that she was as pale as a sheet. "So, people have died here?" Sarah said in a low voice. Joseph's smiling face suddenly dropped as she asked that question. He forced a smile and asked, "Oh, is that a problem?" Before she could respond, I cut in with a sharp, "Oh, no, not at all." Her face looked up at me with a mix of shock and anger as she grabbed my arm to pull me aside. "Are you fucking serious right now?" she shouted at me under her breath. I wanted to say that she was overreacting, but I didn't want to dig my own grave, so I responded as calmly as I could. "Listen, babe, we've been searching for months and this is the best deal we could possibly get." Sarah's face turned to full anger and I braced myself for impact. We excused ourselves from Joseph for about 10 minutes as we walked outside to weigh our options. Ultimately, we decided to go on with the tour and would decide from there. We went back inside the home and looked around to find Joseph, but we couldn't find him. We figured he must have gone upstairs. So we went up to look around the few bedrooms, and still no trace of him. At this point, we had given ourselves our own tour. That's when we stepped into the kitchen to find a door that led down to a basement. He had to be down there. The lights were on, so with Sarah behind me, we cautiously made our way down to the basement. Each of our steps caused the old wood underneath to creak so loudly that it was as if they were screaming as we made our way down. When we finally made it to the bottom, we turned to find Joseph standing in the center of the empty basement, just staring at a dirty wall. I slowly stepped behind him, calling out to him as I got closer to him, but he didn't respond. I took a hand and placed it upon his left shoulder to grab his attention. "Hey man, are you okay?" I asked wearily. Again, he jolted out of a trance and looked back at me. "Oh, I'm so sorry. I was doing some math in my head. I found a bit of water damage on the wall, so I was gonna take it off my asking price for you." I looked at the wall, and sure enough, there was some discoloration on the pale white surface. It didn't look like mold. I'm not sure else how to explain it, aside from the faint black splotches of ink. I looked back to Joseph, and he offered to continue the rest of the tour of the home. Sarah seemed a bit more reluctant, but we agreed and he continued showing us the rest of the home. The only thing that felt off was Joseph's odd behavior. Every now and then, his words would trail off as he shifted his attention toward the walls. The three of us walked outside and Joseph turned to us. "So, what do you think?" Sarah looked at him, then looked at me. "Well, honestly, the fact that a few people died here is a bit unsettling." Joseph's grin quickly turned into a frown. "Oh, I can assure you this old place is worth the buy. On that note, let me change up the offer a little bit." Our jaws nearly dropped when he told us the much cheaper price than when we first talked about it. He told us that he noticed this place would definitely be a fixer-upper, and that he'd be more than happy to know that this place would be going to good hands. Sarah and I talked a bit. With our budget and the price of the house, we'd be saving so much money. I shook Joseph's hand and we quickly got the paperwork situated. A couple of weeks later, everything we owned was packed into a moving truck and we headed towards our new home. We didn't have much, so Sarah and I did everything by ourselves. We were so excited to finally move in that maybe that gave us strength. Thanks to all the money we saved from Joseph's generous offer, we were able to get some furniture delivered, but that was going to take a bit longer, so all we had was my mattress. We decided to drop off all our boxes into the living room, then decide where everything goes afterwards. As I was placing a box down, I couldn't help but notice something on the wall. I stopped Sarah as she dropped off a box behind me. "Hey, are you seeing what I'm seeing?" I asked as I pointed at the wall in the living room. She followed the direction of my finger and saw that on the wall, what looked like a very faint black stain that looked eerily similar to a face. I stepped closer to the wall, and sure enough, there was what looked like the outlines of a head. Long hair that stretched like tentacles, two beady eyes and pursed lips. I know that the human eye tries to find faces in things, but this was uncanny. I placed my hand upon the image on the wall. I felt a cold sting underneath my fingertips. Sarah let out a little chuckle. "Fixer-uppers, right? We'll paint over it or something." "Yeah, absolutely," I said as I felt a wave of unease as I stared at the stain on the wall. It looked as though the face, or what looked like a face, its eyes were staring at me. We continued the rest of the day unpacking and putting things in their spots. It goes without saying that we were completely exhausted. That afternoon, we went back to town to grab dinner. We raised our glasses to a job well done and chowed down on some food. I tried to shake this feeling of unease, but in my mind, I kept remembering that damn stain on the wall. That face. It was around 8 o'clock when we finally returned to the house, to see that the front door was wide open and all the lights were on. I told Sarah to call the cops, and I rushed inside the house to see if there was any intruder. I looked through every inch of the house. Nothing seemed out of place, and I didn't find anyone at all. I went down the stairs into the basement, and I froze in place as I looked on the wall. The stains on the wall. There were now faces. About 6 of them, now formed onto the wall of the basement that Joseph was staring at. Despite being a faint outline, I could make out the same feature on each one. All of them were staring at me, and each one of them had their mouths open in a silent scream. "Honey?" Sarah called out to me from upstairs. and I heard another set of footsteps with hers. I went back upstairs to see Sarah with a police officer. She looked at me with tears in her eyes and told me that I had been gone for so long and that she and the other officer looked around for me. The police officer stuck around for a while as I told him what happened, and despite what we found, nothing seemed to be stolen. He assured us to call him if anything came up and told us to have a good night. After that scare, a good night was the last thing we'd ever have. Sarah was upstairs taking a shower, and I sat on the floor of the unfinished living room, staring at the walls. The face that I had seen earlier right there was gone now. I didn't tell Sarah about the faces I had seen. I'm sure I was just tired from all the moving. I even went back to the basement, and sure enough, there weren't any faces on the walls. I laughed to myself and went upstairs to the master bedroom. I saw Sarah standing in the bathroom with the towel wrapped around her. I tried to be cool and walked towards her, wrapping my arms around her, when I noticed that she was shaking. I spun her around, and I saw her eyes were wide with absolute terror. I asked her what happened, and after a couple of minutes, she told me that while she was taking a shower, she felt someone was watching her. She thought that it was me, but when she turned around, she didn't see anything. She dropped her towel to show me where she felt something grab her, and on the midsection of her back, there was a faint black outline of a hand. Sarah asked if I saw anything, and I did my best to assure her that things would be okay, and that we must just be really tired. She reluctantly agreed. Maybe we'd feel better in the morning after a good night's sleep. I gave her a hug and I looked behind her into the bathroom, and I saw another face staring back at me, but it was smiling. In my sleep, I dreamt that I was laying atop the mattress when I started to feel cold. I looked down to see the outlines of hands within the darkness of my bedroom, wrapping their fingers around me, each bony finger pressing into my skin, squeezing me. My legs, arms, torso, and throat are gripped by countless cold hands. I forced my neck to turn towards Sarah, but the icy grips that were on me forced my head to look upwards at the ceiling, cold fingers prying my eyes open to see. On the ceiling staring down at me were so many faces, no longer outlines. They were so vivid, each face with a different pained expression on them, with one man's face looking down at me with a smile. I awoke the next morning. My body was shivering as I lifted myself up from the mattress. I looked over to Sarah, who was still fast asleep. I tried to take in the tranquil sight of her resting until I looked around the room. It was as if someone had covered their hands in black powder and pressed their hands all around the walls. Handprints of all sizes, pitch black sprawling across every corner of the bedroom. I looked back up towards the ceiling to see that it was completely covered with the dark outlines of screaming faces. I shook Sarah awake. I couldn't keep this to myself any longer, and when she opened her eyes, I told her about the faces that I had been seeing. Her face turned into such a pained look as she told me to look around the room. The walls were completely empty. I went to the nearest hardware store and bought so much white paint. As soon as I got back to the house, I picked up a roller and started frantically painting the walls. We spent days painting the entire inside of the house, but those damn stains, those fucking faces kept coming back. Every night that I slept, I'd have the same dream of cold hands gripping onto me. Lately, I've been hearing something, whispers coming from the walls, telling me to stay in the house, to be with the house. Have I finally gone crazy? Sarah suggests that we move out, but we had put so much money into this, and I refuse to let whatever this is keep coming back. I am not going to let go of this house. It's mine, right? Sarah is telling me that she is afraid, but she doesn't understand that I'm afraid too. I see them everywhere. They're constantly watching us, and I'm more afraid of what happens to us if they hear us talking about leaving again. Back in April of 2013, I was a building and zoning inspector for Mon County, West Virginia. We were situated in an office up in Morgantown, where I usually worked with zoning permits and annual building inspections. Not the most exciting job, but in my line of work, the best day on the job is the day where nothing happens. The fight against entropy is constant, and I had a sign hanging above my desk to remind me of such. It simply read "Everything breaks" in cursive, with a baby cherub in the corner. I remember being called up early one morning. There had been some sort of geological event, and every inspector would be pulled off desk duty. We needed immediate building inspection in the area surrounding the outskirts of Greenbrier Valley. We were to coordinate our efforts with the Central Command up in Greene County. That morning, it seemed like everything was topsy-turvy. The local news talked about an escaped murderer, and we were getting calls about a lake being drained. The local hospital desperately needed blood donations, but couldn't tell us why. Overall, something was up, and neither of us liked it, but we went along with it. I was assigned to a full inspection of a farm close to the epicenter, the Oak Valley Grain Farm. I was handed a dossier on the owner, employees, tax records, zoning permits, all that stuff. But I was practically pushed out the door before I got the chance to go through any of it. I'd only finished half of my morning coffee when I found myself standing in the parking lot, with a stern-looking man impatiently tapping his foot, waiting for me to get on my way. Given the way that they were hurrying us, I got the impression that something terrible had happened. And yet, we were told to expect minimum damage, if any at all. Still, I had to remind myself of that eternal adage, everything breaks. That includes old barley farms. Once I was out on the road, I took some time at a rest stop to go through the dossier, mostly to get a feel for the place and an idea of what to look out for. So, the Oak Valley Grain Farm, a 75-acre area originally established in 1882. The site was used as both a barley farm and a lumber storage yard, as most of the surrounding area was covered in oak trees. A few years into operation, they expanded into having an off-site cooper and making their own barley malt for whiskey production. The original malting facility and accompanying barrel storage was still in use to this day. The one problem I could spot was the historical buildings. Oak Valley had a series of Prohibition-era buildings and underground storages, some of which were still being used. It was all legitimate and more of a quirk than anything, but those areas had not been properly inspected for years. The landlord had been reluctant to allowing inspectors free rein, and Mon County hadn't seen the use in harassing the owner because of what could be at most considered a curiosity. There was about a dozen employees, not counting irregular extra labor, the off-site cooper workshop, and seasonal farm-to-table event organizers. I got there at about 10 a.m. Even from the parking lot, I could still see the rolling hills of sprouting barley. Red birds were circling overhead, some kind of migrating species that had come home to roost. There was a constant low droning in the air, both from machinery and the emerging spring insects. The air was dense with the smell of rain-drenched manure and fertile soil. I was greeted by one of the equipment operators, Elsie, a quiet middle-aged woman with a permanent squint on her face, like she was always blinded by the sun. "Welcome to Oak Valley," she smiled. "Lacey will be out in a minute. Is the landlord in? Mr. Kettleman. Anderson Kettleman?" "Yeah, he's not usually around that much," Elsie sighed. "Lacey is the, de facto boss lady. Runs the day-to-day operations. Anders is sort of an off-hands kind of guy ever since he got sciatica." "I'm sorry to hear that." I nodded. "Let's see the boss lady then." Elsie showed me past the office in silos. I was regretting not putting on more appropriate footwear, but most of my on-site inspections were usually municipal buildings. This was out of my comfort zone, and my feet would have to suffer for it. Manure-ridden water pressed into my socks. I met Lacey Kettleman outside of the workshop. She was busy trying to get a hold of someone to finish the repairs on her secondary combine. Lacey was in her early 30s but had already started to go gray. She held up a finger as we approached, finishing her phone call. and turned to me with an eagerness to walk right through me. I've met a lot of people like Lacey Kettleman before, but there was something about her that put me off. There was something there. "What's this about then?" she asked, crossing her arms. "A standard inspection, ma'am," I said, "on account of the geological event in the area." "We ain't had no geological events," she shrugged. "So your services aren't necessary. This here is a sizable property," I said. "I'm sure you haven't had that much time to check if everything is up to code. I can help you with that, then I'll be on my way." "I appreciate that, but no need. Business as usual." I looked over Elsie, still hovering on the outskirts of the conversation. I clutched my dossier and resumed eye contact. "Miss Kettleman, do you mind explaining the problem with your combine harvester?" "I'm not entirely sure," she said. "That's why I'm trying to get a hold of someone who does." "Then you wouldn't mind me having a look at your garage? Or better yet, the combine?" "The combine doesn't constitute a building, sir. Not much use for a building inspector to look at that. Let's start with the garage then." While Lacey took off with her cell phone in hand, Elsie stayed by my side and guided me around the property. Turns out, Elsie was the one supposed to operate the second combine. Since it was out of commission, she didn't have much to do. She only had access to a few buildings, but it was enough to get me started. First off was the garage. While Lacey had said there'd been no noticeable geological event, there were clear signs of a disturbance. Several items had been knocked off the walls, and there were web-like cracks in the concrete floor. Nothing major, but enough for me to take note. There was no way Lacey was unaware of this. I took some pictures, made some notes, and wandered off to check the storage sheds. Over the next few hours, Elsie escorted me through the grounds. While most buildings were off limits to her, and Lacey was nowhere to be found, I could still check the exterior. And while I didn't see anything obviously dangerous, there were clear signs of the area being disturbed. I could see the ground having shifted downhill from the storage sheds. Entire rows of barley were bent. While waiting for Lacey to meet us by the offices, Elsie and I started wandering by the edge of the grounds. There were plenty of oak trees there, historically used for making their own barrels, and there were several old trails snaking through the undergrowth. We were walking past a gazebo when I noticed an old well. Nothing out of the ordinary at first sight, but I noticed something strange about it. Algae. I took a closer look. Turns out the well was overflowing with water. Elsie seemed just as surprised as I was. "It's been dried out for years," she said. "That's definitely new." There was a pulse to it. Gulps of water making tiny bumps in the surface tension. Algae and lily pads overflowing, making a green circle around the stonework. It had a strange smell to it, like salt and ammonia. Like lake water? This wasn't normal. We met up with Lacey, and I explained the various signs I'd seen from around the farm. Elsie quietly retreated, not wanting to be dragged into the conversation. Lacey just nodded along but didn't seem to react as I told her about the cracked concrete, the tilted rows of barley, or the various disturbed shelves. Seeing as there were clear signs of the area being affected, I told her that I had to take a closer look at the structural integrity of the main buildings. And finally, there was the well. This time, she reacted. She had nodded and accepted everything up to that point, but all of a sudden, she was defending herself. She tried to explain that the well was backed up, and that they'd had problems with water runoff in the past. There was nothing in the dossier about flooding, but Lacey was adamant. Also, arguing with her didn't seem to do us any favors in gaining access to the farm interior. "You can stall all day, Miss Kettleman," I reminded her, "but we're not done until I say so." "We're not keen on government folks skulking around, sir," Lacey smiled. "This place has history." I told her I'd be back the next day, and the day after that. As many days as it took for me to do my job. Lacey just grinned. She wouldn't make it easy for me. I took some time checking in with the other inspectors. Turns out I wasn't the only one who noticed some strange abnormalities. A lot of bursting pipes, it seemed. The local high school was also a mess. not to mention the elementary school over in Juniper. I was given no details about it, except that no one was allowed on the premises, and the entire school was sealed off, even for inspectors. By comparison, my overflowing well was nothing, and still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about Lacey was off. I checked the dossier over and over that night, trying to make a game plan for the following day. I'd take some extra time checking the irrigation and plumbing, and put an emphasis on the interior. Lacey would just have to comply. And yes, I would even check the old Prohibition-era storages. She'd just have to deal with it. I was up bright and early the following morning. I got to the Oak Valley grain farm at about 7 a.m., only to notice that it had been closed. Lacey had put up a sign on the door, closed for renovations. That was it. Maybe she figured we wouldn't have to conduct any inspections if there was no current business being conducted. But that's not how things work. I tried calling her, but got no response. I sent her a single text. She was either to open up the facility for inspection or I had to take legal action. Shortly afterwards, she assured me she'd be there. 1 hour and 30 minutes later, Lacey came out of the main office building. Apparently, she'd been there all along. Strange though, she had no car in the parking lot. She was out of her work clothes, having just slapped on a gray hoodie and a pair of torn jeans. She looked exhausted. "Pleasant morning?" I asked. I cursed myself for forgetting to bring appropriate footwear again. Lacey didn't respond. She just wrapped her arms around herself and just kept her head down. Something was wrong. We headed into the main office. Nothing out of the ordinary. No damage, no problem with the plumbing. All in all, it seemed perfectly fine. I couldn't figure out why she was so reluctant to show it to me. Then I checked the dossier. Of course, there was the Prohibition-era cellar. "All right," I sighed. "Time to head underground." "Is that absolutely necessary?" she asked. "It's a mess. We don't use it for much." "You've been putting off an inspection for a long time, Miss Kettleman. Given the circumstances, I can't really agree with putting it off any further." "It's a cellar," she shrugged. "There's not much that can go wrong with it." "Everything breaks, ma'am." The door to the cellar was so small I had to move sideways to fit. How they moved contraband whiskey through here back in the day was a mystery to me. Still, I was there to check for damages, not sightseeing. We came down to a larger open space, with an 8-foot drop into a storage area. It was about 16 by 20 feet in total. There was an old steel ladder leading down, with 2 open paths leading deeper down. A set of flashlights were hanging on the wall, so I brought one with me. As I put my hand on the first rung of the ladder, I noticed Lacey's expression change. While she'd been angry or frustrated before, she looked almost apologetic now. "This will complicate things," she sighed. "But we'll work it out somehow." "Sure thing. Now, the support seems fine," I said, climbing down. "But there might be damage further in." I stepped away from the ladder, taking in the smell of salt water and ammonia. The moment I did, Lacey pulled the ladder up. This caught me completely by surprise. I hadn't even considered that an option. The ladder just rattled away, and I was left down there. It was so sudden that I didn't know what to say. I just threw my arms out in a confused shrug. "What the hell?" "I'm sorry." "Like hell you are. Put the ladder back." "I can't. I'm calling the police." There was no coverage. We were too far underground. I was slowly realizing that she was going to leave me down there. All I had was this flimsy flashlight and a couple of hours of battery on my phone. Lacey remained up there, holding the ladder. I could feel my heart pounding, drowning out the backyard noise in my mind. I was growing short of breath, struggling to exhale. I've never been claustrophobic, but this was something else. Something darker. A real, actual threat to my life. "They came to me, looking for shelter," Lacey said. "They speak, you know." "What are you talking about?" "They said you were coming, and I want to hear what else they have to say." "You can't keep me here." "We just need time." "What do you—" There was a sound coming from one of the corridors. My heart shrunk and floated up in my throat. I held my breath, trying to hear the sound through my hammering pulse. I could feel my fingertips growing cold. There was a strange hissing sound, like someone trying to start a dying motor. Lacey stood at attention, listening intently. Something was down there with me. "We came to their home," Lacey whispered. "Now they're coming to ours." I backed into the corner of the room, only now noticing the thin layer of water covering the dirt floor. I turned off the flashlight and listened, trying to calm myself enough not to go into hyperventilation. Something was coming this way. Footsteps. "Hello?" Lacey whispered. "Will you speak to me?" The footsteps stopped. There was another hissing noise, rattling me. It felt like someone was playing the fiddle with my nerves. "Of course," said Lacey. "He's all yours." I could hear her stand up to leave, taking the ladder with her. The footsteps came closer, closer. I tried to move, but I made too much noise. The footsteps stopped for a moment. I thought I'd scared it, frightened it, made it hesitant. Then it burst into a sprint. I turned my flashlight back on and ran down the corridor on the opposite side of the room. I tore down all kinds of debris as I went. Planks, old barrels, empty jars, whatever I could get my hands on. I glanced back, catching a pair of eyes coming from out of the dark. A wide shark-like mouth. A side room, some kind of meeting area. I jumped over a table, knocked it down, and backed away. Seconds later, the table was smashed in two. Fragments of wood scattered across the room, making my nose itch. But the thing stopped. It stayed just outside of my vision, on the edge of the flashlight. It hissed again, sending another shiver up my spine. But somewhere in that vibration, I heard something. It wasn't a word, but a collection of scrambled thoughts, much like a word square. A jumble of information that you had to find your own meaning in. But rest assured, there was meaning. Fear, anger, hunger. What do you want from me?" I asked. My flashlight flickered, and the thing twitched. It was ready to strike, like a coiled snake. It hissed in response. Hunger, hunger, sadness. I retreated into the corner of the room, accidentally knocking over a shelf of empty bottles. I could see the reflection of those dark eyes shining back at me as they patrolled back and forth, looking for an opening. Another hiss, a pleading, a promise, a bone-chilling coldness. It was starting to sound like language, an old primal language, a language that could summarize so much with so little. I fumbled with my hands, looking for the biggest bottle I could find. Finally, I got a hold of an old wine bottle, waiting for the creature to hiss again. I readied the bottle for a throw. As soon as I felt that tingle in my spine, I knew what I was about to hear. I stood up, lowered my flashlight, and threw as hard as I could. There was a thick, fleshy thunk. The hissing stopped, and I could see the dark eyes rise another 2 feet into the air. The thing had been hunched over. Now it was taller than the tunnel itself. It flinched, spitting out another word. With that single word, a series of impressions washed over me. Cold, water-filled tunnels, the crunch of raw fish bone in my mouth, dying men in black togas, giving praise to a drowned god, hoping against hope to see another dawn. I didn't notice I'd been zoning out. I'd leaned the flashlight downwards, and I could see those dark orbs inching closer. I backed up against the wall and inched away, effectively sidestepping my way around the room. The creature followed my movements, matching them. I ended up with my back against the corridor, so I turned to run. It was right behind me, and it was fast. I just kept going, hearing the hissing coming closer. Hunger, joy, hunger, warmth. I went straight through the storage room and into the opposing corridor. It twisted and turned, only to spit me out into a room with a slightly lower floor. I fell forward haphazardly, spraining my ankle and dropped the flashlight. In an instant, the flashlight flickered. and died. I fumbled through my pockets, bringing out my phone. My hands were shaking so bad that I couldn't unlock the screen. On the third try, I got it open, and the flashlight app came on. This time, the creature was almost upon me. It screeched and retreated, blinded. It had too many limbs, too many everything. Anger, desperation. Leaving my phone on, I tried to get back on my feet. I couldn't. My foot was too badly sprained. I could jump around a bit at most, but I was no match for whatever was out there. Instead, I looked around the side room I was in. It must have been a kind of armory. There were broken wooden crates and used-up shotgun shells littering the floor. A used-up old oil lamp on the wall. Don't come in here. I'm not dying here. Hissing, a strange word hidden in the fog of my mind. A man handing a venomous snake to a golden woman. Rolling hills of endless crucified men. A certainty of a violent death. The wailing song of the doomed. It didn't understand my fear. I was already doomed. There was no point in fighting it. To the creature in the dark, time was an insignificant factor. I realized I'd been sitting there listening to it hiss at me for at least 10 minutes. My cell phone was running hot, and the water level had risen by about an inch. Of course, the water level. There had to be water coming from somewhere. Everything breaks. It was a miracle that I hadn't seen it before. There was an overturned table in the middle of the room. That's what I'd sprained my ankle on, kicking it with my good foot. I revealed a crack in the dirt floor from which the water came bubbling up. A few lily pads popped up, their coloration a strange blue, like a sad sunflower. The crack in the floor might have been the remains of a well, or the start of a tunnel going deeper underground. Either way, I had to take a chance. There was no telling how deep it went. I could drown, but I could also find my way out. I left my cell phone with the light shining on the entrance, holding the creature back. With a final screech, it conveyed a final picture. Webbed fingers, deep underground, tearing a human body to pieces. I took the plunge. I crawled my way forward, inch by inch. The wet dirt barely gave me any grip, and the water stung my eyes. My nails hurt from all the debris trying to dig into my fingers. I could feel my chest tightening, cramping, a fork in the path. I went left, a current, a stream, brushing something slimy out of my face, a tilt upwards, cold, can't feel my arms, hunger, reaching, hunger. I broke through the surface. I was in the stone well. I threw myself out, gasping for air, looking back only to see something just under the surface of the overflowing well. Two black orbs retreated into the dark, sinking back into the unfathomable depths. I made my way to the nearest road and flagged down the first car I could see. Lacey Kettleman was brought in for questioning, but that's all I know. There was no trial, no debriefing. I just told about my experience to a stern-looking man in a suit, and that was that. I was told to sign an NDA lasting a minimum of 10 years. It ended recently, and I've been waiting to tell my story. Anders Kettleman eventually took back control of the Oak Valley grain farm. As far as I know, Lacey never went to jail. Something must have happened, though. She was missing for the better part of a decade. Maybe she had something they wanted. I think that whatever I met in Oak Valley had something to do with the crisis of 2013. There were a lot of rumors coming out of that area, and I'm sure at least some of them originated with whatever Lacey had invited to stay in her cellar. There haven't been many others coming forward about their experiences of that incident, but I know they're out there. Maybe they're hoping we've all moved on or forgotten. Maybe they've been safe behind their contracts and fear tactics. But I'd like to remind them, as much as I reminded myself every day, everything breaks.